Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Michael, and I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire. Our neighborhood was surrounded by apartment complexes and townhouses built in the early 90s. Most of my friends lived in these buildings, and I would often go there to hang out with them. One autumn evening, when I was 12 years old, we lost track of time playing video games in the community center at the heart of the complex. It must have been around 9:30 when the power suddenly went out. A thunderstorm had been brewing all day, and I guess it finally knocked out the electricity. My friends all hurried back to their apartments, but since I lived outside the complex, I had to make my way home alone. I wasn't particularly scared. I'd made this journey dozens of times, but that night was different. The darkness was absolute. No stars peeked through the thick cloud cover. No car headlights illuminated the paths, and an eerie silence had descended over everything. Even the usual sounds of the interstate in the distance had disappeared. I walked slowly, feeling my way forward with careful steps, trying to follow the concrete path that would lead me to the exit. The wind had picked up, sending dry leaves skittering across my path and whispering through the trees that lined the walkways. As I turned a corner near Building 7, I spotted a light, a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the ground. An elderly man was crouched down, seemingly searching for something. When he noticed me, he straightened up and called out, "Son, what are you doing out here all alone? It's dangerous to be wandering around in the dark like this." His voice was warm and carried a slight southern accent. There was genuine concern in his tone. "I was at my friend's place," I explained. "I'm trying to get home." "This storm isn't letting up anytime soon," he said, glancing upward. "Why don't you come inside for a bit? You can call your folks from our landline." Today, such an invitation from a stranger might seem alarming, but back in those days, especially in our community, people looked out for each other. Everyone knew everyone, and it wasn't unusual for an adult to help a child in need. Besides, there was something trustworthy about the man's weathered face, illuminated in the glow of his flashlight. I followed him into Building 7, up to the 3rd floor. The stairwell was pitch black, but his flashlight guided our way. When he opened his apartment door, I was surprised by the inviting warmth that greeted me. The space was illuminated by dozens of candles, casting a golden glow across vintage furniture. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine. Inside, I saw he wasn't alone. A teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17, sat at a chess table, while a little girl about 7 years old was flipping through a picture book by candlelight. "Found this young man wandering outside in the storm," the elderly man explained to them. "Thought we'd offer him some shelter until it passes." The teenage boy nodded at me, then returned to studying his chess pieces. The little girl, however, stared at me with unwavering curiosity. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" the man asked, already moving toward what I assumed was the kitchen. "It'll warm you right up." As he prepared the drink, I noticed something odd. Despite the power outage, their apartment felt disconnected from the storm outside. I couldn't hear the wind or rain, which had been howling just moments before. It was as if this apartment existed in its own little bubble. The man returned with a steaming mug. "Careful now, it's hot," he warned. Then, sitting across from me, he added something that struck me as peculiar. "It's dangerous out there on nights like this. I don't even let Eliza near the windows after sunset. Just going to the corner store can be risky." I thought this was a bit excessive. It was just a power outage after all, but I didn't say anything. The hot chocolate was rich and delicious, unlike any I'd tasted before. The teenage boy suddenly looked up from his chess game. "What's your name?" he asked. But before I could answer, the lights flickered back on. The sudden brightness made me blink rapidly. When my eyes adjusted, I noticed how faded the furniture was, how the wallpaper seemed to belong to a different era entirely. The elderly man reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar coin. "Here," he said, pressing it into my palm. "Take this for the bus fare home. Don't want you walking in this weather." I thanked him profusely, tucked the coin into my pocket, and made my way out. The moment I stepped outside the building, everything changed. The storm had subsided, leaving only a light drizzle. Car engines hummed in the distance, and streetlights illuminated the wet pavement. An overwhelming sense of relief washed over me, though I couldn't explain why. 3 days later, I decided to return the silver dollar. It didn't seem right to keep it, especially after such kindness. I went back to Building 7 and climbed to the 3rd floor. I stood before the apartment door, 303, and knocked. As I waited, a woman passed by with a laundry basket. She gave me a curious look. "Who are you looking for, honey?" "The elderly man who lives here," I replied. "He helped me during the power outage and gave me this coin. I wanted to return it." The woman's expression changed from curiosity to confusion, then to something resembling concern. She set her laundry basket down. "Sweetheart, there's nobody living in that apartment," she said softly. "It's been vacant for over 3 years now. The building manager can't seem to keep tenants in there for long." My head spun. I leaned against the wall, trying to process what she was saying. "But I was just here," I insisted. 3 nights ago, there was an old man, a teenage boy, and a little girl named Eliza." At the mention of Eliza, the woman's face paled. She took a step back. "Where did you hear that name?" she whispered. "The man mentioned it," I said, increasingly unsettled by her reaction. She picked up her laundry basket hastily. "You should go home, honey. Some things are better left alone." Before leaving, she hesitated, then added, "If you're interested in history, look up the Winters family at the library. Building 7, Apartment 303, 1973. I spent weeks trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe the family had moved out immediately after I met them. Perhaps I had misremembered the apartment number. But deep down, I knew something inexplicable had occurred that night. I eventually did visit the library and discovered that in 1973, the Winters family, Father Jacob, son Thomas, and daughter Eliza, had perished in a fire that started in their apartment during a severe thunderstorm and power outage. The official report stated that candles left unattended were the likely cause. Even now, decades later, I sometimes take out that silver dollar coin, dated 1972, and wonder about the night I spent in an apartment that shouldn't have existed, with people who had long since passed from this world. My hometown has always been home to unusual occurrences, and to this day, I'm still trying to understand what really happened on that stormy night so many years ago. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Ever since I can remember, I've been captivated by horror stories. It doesn't matter if they're in movies, books, or any other format. I'm constantly searching for something new to explore within the genre. Despite this fascination, I never considered myself emotionally prepared to face paranormal phenomena firsthand. Besides, I'm an extremely skeptical person. Whenever something strange happens, my instinct is to seek and find a logical explanation. But what I'm about to tell you completely defies the ordinary. This experience happened to me and my friend Felix in 2018. And to this day, I can't find a satisfactory explanation for what we witnessed. I've never heard of anyone who's experienced something similar. It wasn't the first time something strange happened to me in that place, but this time it was much more intense. Every time I return there, I feel an uneasiness I can't explain. The place is in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. If you prefer to keep the details vague, just know that it occurred in a mountainous area known for its rock formations and extensive trails. I have a habit of photographing landscapes, and an acquaintance who's also a photographer invited me for a hike there. I accepted, but not knowing the area well, I invited some friends to join me. We used the opportunity as an excuse to spend a weekend away from the city after so much tension and isolation because of the pandemic. We organized everything carefully, rented a cabin to spend the night, and planned 2 days in the region. The cabin faced a rocky elevation with an incredible view. We were greeted by a very friendly couple, the cabin owner and her husband, who gave us various tips for exploring the Adirondacks and visiting the nearest small town, which was somewhat remote. Something curious caught my attention. The cabin's decoration was full of objects related to UFOs. When I showed interest, the owner commented that, as fantastic as it might seem, she and her husband had lived there for years and had witnessed numerous strange sightings over those mountains, especially in an area known by locals as the Twins. The hike we initially planned wasn't supposed to be at night, but the person organizing the excursion was delayed. Because of this, my other friends decided not to go, but Felix, one of my best friends, decided to accompany me. He also loves stories about the paranormal, and we've had similar adventures together before. We enjoy exploring forests and caves regardless of the time of day. We've gotten lost, heard mysterious sounds, and seen things difficult to explain. But we always make the most of these adventures, supporting each other mutually. Around 11 at night, we met the group that would guide us along the trail. The path led into the heart of the Adirondacks, and according to them, was called the Guardian's Trail, although the name varies among residents. One of the guides knew the route well because he lived nearby, but the darkness was oppressive. Without flashlights, it was impossible to see more than a few inches ahead. The local vegetation closed in, forming an almost complete blockade against any light. As we advanced along the trail, our guide began to share some stories related to that region of the Adirondacks. He mentioned accidents that had occurred there, often involving people who went up to use illegal substances and ended up getting lost, needing to be rescued, sometimes even by helicopters. Besides that, he told a local legend. The mountain had a guardian, and according to the belief, anyone who was disrespectful upon entering might be prevented from leaving. Stories like these tend to impress some people, but that wasn't our case. We continued walking until we reached a lookout point that offered an incredible view of the illuminated town in the distance. While the group was taking photos, I also tried to take some initially, but something bothered me. I ended up putting away my equipment and remained beside my friend Felix. At one point, we both moved a little away from the group, driven by curiosity to explore the place on our own. Even so, we stayed close enough to hear the conversations of the others. Suddenly, almost as if we had planned it, we looked back at the same time. What we saw was a small clearing, an area with a ground covered in stones, surrounded by dense vegetation that blocked practically all light. Everything was very dark except for one detail. At the back of the clearing, a perfectly drawn triangle on the ground seemed to emit a soft, silvery light. The figure was clear, impossible to ignore. My mind immediately tried to find a rational explanation for it. Perhaps it was the shadows of trees forming some pattern, but the clarity of that triangle was impressive. I looked at Felix, and he was also observing with attention, clearly as intrigued as I was. Despite being accustomed to exploring challenging places, neither of us dared to take a single step toward the clearing. This is something that still intrigues me. What stopped us? We faced dangerous situations before and always moved forward, but this time something held us back. There was another strange detail that we only remembered later. We both had flashlights in our hands, and when we tried to illuminate the triangle, the lights began to fail, flickering non-stop despite having freshly charged batteries. It was as if something in that area prevented any attempt at illumination. We reported what we saw to the group, but no one seemed to give it importance. I don't know if they didn't notice, or if they simply ignored it. Felix and I, however, couldn't take our eyes off that figure. We stood there observing it for a good while, feeling a growing anxiety to leave, but aware that it would be impossible to return alone through the dense forest. We needed to wait for the rest of the group. While we waited, we kept checking to see if the triangle was still there, and it remained unchanged. I felt restless, but tried not to show it. As I mentioned before, we're not the type to be easily carried away by stories or assumptions. Still, that moment aroused a nervousness I couldn't justify. Later, back at the cabin, Felix confided in me that he also felt something very strong, a paralyzing fear, almost like a premonition of imminent danger. He described the sensation as a fear of death. Curiously, as soon as we began the descent, the flashlights started working normally again. The group that was with us, however, wanted to make one more stop to take photos, experimenting with light painting, a photographic technique where, with the camera configured for long exposure, light sources are used to draw in the air, creating luminous trails. This required us to remain in complete darkness. At this point, Felix, who had drunk a lot of water before we started, commented to me that he urgently needed to go to the bathroom. We always try to respect the places we visit, never leave trash or take anything with us. But on that occasion, Felix had no choice. He moved away a few yards from the trail to have some privacy, while I stayed on the path at a point where I wouldn't disturb the group taking photos with light, but also wasn't completely alone. The darkness around me was total. After a few minutes, I suddenly heard hurried footsteps coming in my direction. The sound was intense, as if someone was running desperately. Instinctively, I turned on my flashlight and pointed it toward the noise. It was Felix. He was running at full speed, his face pale and an expression of pure terror. He needed a few moments to catch his breath and finally tell me what had happened. He explained that as he approached some bushes to take care of his business, he heard a strange sound. He pointed his flashlight in the direction of the noise and saw something that looked like feet, white feet that went up to the knees. They weren't human feet, but they didn't look like those of any animal he knew either. They were of a frightening white color. As soon as the flashlight beam hit them, the figure darted away. Felix described its movements as inhuman, strangely awkward but very fast. The sound it made as it moved was loud and disturbing, as if something large was moving among the bushes. Terrified, he ran back to me as fast as he could. After hearing his account, I was also gripped by fear. We both insisted that we should leave immediately. We asked the group to hurry with the photos, and as soon as possible, we returned to the cabin. When we reunited with our other friends, we told them what had happened. Gradually, the panic dissipated as we talked and laughed about other, less tense stories. The next morning, as we were turning in the keys to the cabin, the owner came to talk to me. What she said made me freeze. She commented that she had tried to contact me during the night, but couldn't reach me. I found that strange because I always keep my phone with me, especially because of work. She explained that she wanted to warn me to observe the mountain because, according to her, the lights had returned that night. She mentioned that these lights often appeared in a triangular formation above the area known as the Twins, and that many locals believed they were signs of something not of this world. She also said, almost in a whisper, that people who had gone hiking in that area at night sometimes reported seeing pale, strange figures moving unnaturally fast among the trees. Felix and I exchanged a look, but said nothing. We thanked her for the information, packed our things, and headed back to the city. On the drive home, we made a pact to never hike at night in the Adirondacks again. To this day, I can't explain what we saw in that clearing, or what Felix encountered in the darkness. But sometimes at night, when I look at the stars, I can't help but remember that perfectly formed triangle glowing with silvery light, and I wonder what would have happened if we had stepped into that clearing. Some mysteries are perhaps better left unsolved, and some thresholds better left uncrossed. Night security guards collect surprising stories, filled with both good and terrible moments. It's true that many nights pass peacefully in the silence of the early morning hours. But what happens when that tranquility is shattered by something completely unusual and terrifying? My name is Marcus, and I'm writing to share something that happened to me years ago while working as a night security guard. I don't know how to classify what I experienced, but by sharing it, I hope to find some answers. What I'm about to tell you involves something paranormal, but exactly what occurred, whether caused by someone or by some unknown force, I simply don't know. I worked as a night security guard at a tech startup in downtown Seattle, in a renovated 6-story industrial building. Even at night, the area had some foot traffic, mostly late-night workers and bar hoppers. I never faced dangerous situations, break-ins, or anything similar. The building had a sophisticated security system with reinforced doors impossible to breach without triggering multiple alarms. I had permission to take short naps during my shift. Usually around 3 in the morning, I'd take a brief 30-minute rest. My security station was well protected, and I was confident nothing would happen. Until everything changed on one particular night. I woke abruptly from one of these naps and found myself experiencing something I'd only heard about before: sleep paralysis. I was sitting in my chair, reclined against the wall with my feet propped up on a small stool, completely immobile. I couldn't move my hands, feet, or head. In the midst of this panic, I noticed a woman, maybe in her early 30s, standing outside my glass security booth. She was inside the building, just a few steps away from me. The expression on her face was unnervingly playful, almost mocking. She appeared completely normal. Nothing about her suggested anything supernatural. In that moment, I thought she might have drugged me somehow. Perhaps made me inhale some chemical to incapacitate me while planning a robbery. But nothing made sense. Why hadn't the alarms gone off? How had she gotten in? Fighting against fear and immobility, with my head pressed against the wall and my eyes fixed on her, I watched as she opened her mouth and said, "Aren't you going to stand up?" Then she laughed. Her laughter echoed down the hallway to my left as she walked away, disappearing from my sight. The moment she vanished, I felt my body return to normal. I immediately radioed a colleague, requested backup, and reported that someone had breached the building. I grabbed my equipment and headed toward where I'd heard a door slamming. I clearly saw the door closing. It was the server room. The hallway lights were on, and I knew I wasn't imagining things. I found this very strange. The server room was a secured area that required keycard access, containing valuable equipment and sensitive data. I rushed over, swiped my access card, and flung open the door only to find absolute emptiness. There was nobody there. Still, I decided to investigate, looking around for any possible hiding spots or exits. There was nothing except the humming server racks and blinking lights. It was while examining the room that I heard that laugh again. Only this time, the sound came from behind me. The problem was, behind me was just a solid wall of servers. That's when realization dawned on me. That night, no living person had entered the building. Terrified, I ran out of that server room, my heart pounding, and returned to the security booth, making the sign of the cross. I reported everything to my colleague, who had access to the security cameras. He confirmed my fears by finding no evidence of an intruder, which meant I hadn't imagined anything. It had all really happened. The rest of the night was filled with tension. I didn't need coffee to stay awake. Fear kept me alert. I remained in the security booth trying to distract my mind with the security monitors until dawn, but always keeping an eye on the door, hoping not to see that woman again. Many people say that spirits, or what we commonly call ghosts, don't have the ability to induce sleep paralysis. Perhaps what caused my experience was something else, something that left my body in this state. It might have been a natural phenomenon, but I can't ignore the fact that the paralysis disappeared at the exact moment she vanished from my sight. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever understand what happened that night. The security company later told me that the building had been constructed over the site of an old mental health facility from the 1920s. I've often wondered if there was a connection, but I never took another shift at that location to find out. Whatever visited me that night, it wasn't there to steal anything tangible, but it certainly took something from me, my sense of security and my peaceful nights of sleep for months afterward. I never knew the complete truth about how I came into this world. If it weren't for my grandparents who decided to reveal everything years later, I might still believe my childhood was as ordinary as anyone else's. My name is Emily Blackwood. When I was only 7 years old, I lost my parents and was raised by my paternal grandparents, Walter and Margaret, in a small town called Ravenwood on the misty coast of Maine. From an early age, they educated me according to the traditions of their Methodist faith. I was baptized in the town church, learned to pray, and we attended service every Sunday, always maintaining a peaceful and affectionate routine. However, since childhood, I had dreams I couldn't explain. In many of them, I saw a distant woman watching me. She was thin with long auburn hair, always dressed in dark clothing. I tried to approach her several times, but I could never see her face clearly. When I told my grandfather about these dreams, he explained that the woman was my guardian angel. He said that God chose an angel for each person before they were even born, and that this angel protected us throughout our lives. At the time, I was 7 years old and believed everything my grandfather told me. I began to pray every night, asking that woman to watch over my parents wherever they might be, and to tell them how much I missed them. Things changed when I turned 9. I began to see figures that seemed to belong to another world. Some looked like ordinary people, while others had frightening features and stares that caused a fear I couldn't explain. I reported this to my grandmother, who said they were angels sent by God. Despite trying to believe her, something told me it wasn't true. Those beings looked nothing like the angels described in church. There were nights when these episodes became even more intense. On one occasion, I heard a strange sound in my room, as if someone was chewing something. I called my grandparents, who searched the entire room but found nothing. My grandfather decided to spend that night with me, and while trying to calm me down, he began to talk about my mother. It was the first time anyone had mentioned anything about her. According to him, my mother was an extraordinary woman who loved me deeply, but no one else in the family talked about her. I didn't have any photos of her, and I only knew my father's face from an old picture my grandfather kept. The strange events continued. One night, while doing my homework, I heard noises coming from the closet. I gathered my courage and opened the door, but it was empty. Shortly after, I felt my blanket being pulled as I tried to sleep. It was as if a small figure was trying to climb onto my bed. When it finally succeeded, I saw it was a tiny being with the appearance of an elderly man, but the size of a doll. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. It approached my face slowly, and the malicious smile it gave made me let out a scream. My grandparents rushed into the room. For a while, I believed everything had finally calmed down. My grandparents intensified their prayers, and my grandmother placed a blessed rosary in my room. But one night, while I was sleeping deeply, I again felt the presence of that malevolent creature. Before I even opened my eyes, something told me something was wrong. A constant sound echoed through the room, as if something was being dragged across the floor. I tried to move, but it was as if my body was trapped awake but unable to react. The noise became clearer, and I felt a slight weight beside my head. With great effort, I opened my eyes and saw it again. That little man was standing next to the bed, with the same sinister smile as before. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He put his finger in front of his lips, asking for silence, while shaking something in one of his hands. It was a small bell. The sound seemed to pass through walls, echoing in an unnatural way. Shadows began to fill the room, vague forms, with disfigured faces emerging from the corners and floating in the air. They approached until I could feel the cutting cold of their presence. I don't know how long this lasted before the bedroom door suddenly opened. My grandmother entered first with an expression of fury I had never seen before. Right behind her came my grandfather, holding his cane firmly. When they saw them, the creature let out a high-pitched scream and ran to a corner of the room. My grandfather tried to hit it with his cane, but it passed through the being's body as if it were made of smoke. Still, the creature reacted with anger, and its screams attracted more shadows that began to surround my grandparents. The scene was chaos. My grandmother prayed loudly while my grandfather, with courage, tried to protect us with what he could. Suddenly, the small being charged at them with frightening speed. My grandfather tried to face it, but fell to the floor during the struggle, clutching his chest. My grandmother, though exhausted, continued praying with an intensity I had never heard before. Finally, the creature disappeared, but not without leaving behind a chilling laugh that echoed through the entire house. I ran to my grandfather, who was lying on the floor. My grandmother tried to help him, but his condition was serious. Not knowing what to do, I called our neighbor, Mrs. Parker, who was very close to our family. Her son answered, and upon hearing what was happening, came running to help us. He called an ambulance, but when the paramedics arrived, it was too late. My grandfather had suffered a heart attack. That night changed everything in my life. The loss of my grandfather left an enormous void in our family, but also brought to light a truth that my grandmother could no longer hide. After the funeral, she called me to her room with a serious air, opened an old wooden box, and took out something that completely changed my vision of everything I had experienced, a photograph of my mother. For the first time, I saw her face. She had the same emerald eyes as mine, and her countenance exuded a mixture of strength and mystery. With tears in her eyes, my grandmother said it was time for me to know the whole truth. According to her account, my mother was a woman of striking uniqueness, but her path became shrouded in the darkness of witchcraft. Initially, she was sought after for her healing abilities and spiritual cleansing rituals. The townspeople believed she possessed a rare talent for helping those in need. However, at some point, my mother allowed herself to be drawn into darker practices, seduced by promises of power and protection. My grandmother claimed it was these choices that brought tragedy to our family. The first to be affected was my father. He was strong, healthy, full of energy, but began to mysteriously fall ill. He lost weight rapidly, lost his appetite, and within a few months, an aggressive cancer took his life. Overcome with guilt and terror, my mother distanced herself from everything, leaving me in the care of my grandparents. That was the last day anyone saw her. My grandmother also confessed that after my mother's disappearance, she began having dreams in which my mother asked for me to be protected. She claimed that dark forces would come after me to collect the debts she had left behind. That's why my grandparents decided to strengthen their faith even more. They baptized me and raised me under God's protection. After hearing all this, many previously incomprehensible things began to make sense. The strange figures I had seen since childhood, the inexplicable noises in my room, and especially the presence of that malevolent little being. My grandmother explained that these phenomena were direct consequences of my mother's choices and the enemies she accumulated throughout her life. The most frightening realization, however, was understanding that these dark forces had not disappeared, but remained seeking vengeance. In the weeks that followed, my grandmother became determined to find ways to protect us. Although she was a devout Methodist, she turned to Mrs. Sullivan, a respected folk healer in town. Despite not believing in these practices, her desperation to save me led her to try. According to Mrs. Sullivan, since my birth, my mother had left a mark on me, a kind of trace that allowed shadowy entities to locate me. She explained that even when entrusting me to my grandparents for protection, my mother couldn't completely break the bond. To ward off these forces, Mrs. Sullivan performed various spiritual cleansings in our house, with herbs and prayers that seemed to resonate in every corner. She tried to purify the environment and also gave me an amulet that I should carry with me at all times. These measures brought some relief, but didn't completely eliminate the phenomena. The shadows still appeared from time to time, albeit with less intensity. On one specific night, while in my room, I was again overtaken by that sensation of cold and oppression, as if the air around me was heavy. I woke up startled, and looking at the window, I saw a shadow larger than the others hovering in the air. Its form was indefinite, but its eyes glowed with an intense crimson. I was paralyzed, unable to move as it slowly approached. At that moment, I remembered the amulet hanging around my neck. I clutched it with all my strength and began to pray, even though I knew few words. The shadow hesitated for an instant, but didn't disappear. It remained there, motionless, watching me as if waiting for something. The next morning, I told my grandmother what had happened. Her expression was one of deep concern, and that very afternoon, we returned to Mrs. Sullivan's house. The healer received us with a serious countenance, as if already anticipating the reason for our visit. After hearing my account, she explained that the malevolent spirits were intensifying their advances because they knew the time to reach me was running out. Despite the spiritual protection around us being strong, according to her, it wasn't unbreakable. Mrs. Sullivan proposed a more elaborate ritual, something that would require total commitment. Without hesitation, my grandmother agreed, and the preparations began that same night. The ritual was conducted in the main room of our house. Mrs. Sullivan drew symbols on the floor using salt and ashes, while my grandmother and I held lit candles. The words she pronounced, in a firm and almost supernatural tone, made my skin crawl, as if each sound carried a powerful energy. During the ritual, the environment became visibly colder. The candle flames flickered, and shadows began to appear around the circle that Mrs. Sullivan had drawn. Although they didn't cross the boundary, the pressure of their presence was suffocating. At one point, one of the candles suddenly went out, and the amulet around my neck began to heat up, slightly burning my skin. Sensing the intensification of the forces around us, Mrs. Sullivan elevated her prayers until gradually the shadows dispersed. Despite the apparent success of the ritual, Mrs. Sullivan was emphatic in saying that the battle was far from over. According to her, as long as I was alive, these forces wouldn't give up because my existence represented the debts left by my mother. She advised us to remain vigilant and continuously reinforce our spiritual defenses. The following days were marked by an unsettling calm. The shadows appeared less frequently, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly watched. My grandmother placed amulets in every corner of the house and taught me to pray with more dedication. Although I tried to maintain a normal routine, fear persisted like a constant presence in the back of my mind. This false tranquility, however, didn't last. One night, being alone in the house, I heard that familiar sound, the creaking, coming from my closet. This time, fear didn't dominate me. Holding the amulet in one hand and a lit candle in the other, I approached slowly. I opened the door abruptly, ready for anything, but initially saw nothing. When I bent down to examine more closely, two small, bright eyes stared at me from the back of the closet. It was the same minute creature I had seen before, but this time its gaze was laden with hatred. Before I could react, the creature lunged with impressive speed and hit me in the chest with force. I was thrown backward. The candle escaped from my hand and went out as it fell to the floor, plunging the room into total darkness. Feeling an intense pain in my chest, as if the blow had left an invisible mark, I tried to catch my breath. The sound of the creature's claws scratching the floor echoed around me, and fear almost immobilized me. Even so, I knew I couldn't surrender. Without the strength to run, I began to drag myself toward the door, desperately seeking any source of light. Upon reaching the doorframe, a sound behind me made me stop. It was a whisper laden with scorn. Turning my head, I saw that small creature again, now standing in front of my closet, holding what looked like a miniature bell. However, when it rang it, the sound that echoed was deafening, as if it were summoning something beyond my comprehension. Suddenly, shadows began to take over the room once more, but this time with sharp contours. Their faces were deformed, their gazes overflowed with hatred, and they weren't limited to hovering as before. Now they advanced in my direction with clear intention. I tried to pray, but my voice was muffled as if something was squeezing my throat, silencing me. It was at that moment that the house door opened abruptly. My grandmother, who had arrived earlier than expected, heard the noise and ran to my room. As soon as she opened the door, the light from the hallway invaded the space. and the shadows hesitated for an instant. However, the small being remained motionless, as if the brightness didn't affect it. My grandmother entered with determination, wielding a large wooden cross she had brought from the church. Without hesitation, she began to pray loudly, and her strength was something I had never witnessed before. The small being reacted with wrath, dropped the bell, and charged at her, but the cross seemed to contain it. A shrill scream filled the room, and it retreated, disappearing into the closet along with the shadows. My grandmother came to me, helped me up, and continued praying as we both left the room, still overcome with terror. We locked the door, and that night she concluded that we couldn't face this alone any longer. The next morning, we sought out Mrs. Sullivan again. When we reported what had happened, she showed genuine concern. According to her, that creature was a vengeful spirit, an emissary of dark forces seeking to recover something they considered rightfully theirs. Mrs. Sullivan explained that in her final days, my mother performed a ritual in desperation to protect me. However, this act only intensified the entity's anger. The solution she suggested was a complete exorcism of the house, something that would require the participation of an experienced minister. However, she warned that not all clergymen would agree to perform such a ritual. Even reluctantly, my grandmother agreed to try. In the days that followed, we managed to contact Reverend Thomas from a nearby town, known for dealing with cases of possession and paranormal phenomena. When he arrived at our house, his presence immediately brought a sensation of serenity and strength. There was something about him that filled every space with security. He walked through all the rooms, holding a rosary and murmuring prayers while analyzing every detail. When he reached my room, he suddenly stopped. He said that an extremely intense energy was concentrated there, something that was neither natural nor benign. The exorcism began at nightfall. We gathered in the living room, my grandmother, Mrs. Sullivan, and I, while the Reverend prepared. He positioned blessed candles at the four corners of the room and drew a cross with holy oil on the door. Then he began to chant prayers in Latin, his firm voice reverberating throughout the house. Initially, everything remained calm, but it wasn't long before the same shadows began to emerge. They floated through the environment as if trying to intimidate him. The Reverend, however, showed no sign of hesitation. Suddenly, the shadows began to concentrate at a single point, the closet. From there came the sound of the bell, accompanied by a deep, animalistic scream that seemed to make the walls vibrate. The closet door opened violently, and the small creature emerged with a look even more laden with hatred. It tried to advance against the Reverend, but was repelled by the cross he raised while chanting a powerful prayer. The creature screamed, its inhuman voice echoing through the room. The confrontation dragged on for what seemed like an endless time. The shadows tried to attack several times, but the Reverend remained firm, moved by faith and determination. Finally, the being dissolved into the air, and the shadows slowly disappeared. When everything was over, a deep silence took over the house. Reverend Thomas remained in the living room, praying softly, while my grandmother and I were still trying to understand what had happened. Mrs. Sullivan collected the remains of the candles and the amulets used in the ritual. Although the environment seemed lighter, I knew that wasn't a definitive closure. The Reverend told us that while the ritual had managed to expel the creature and the shadows, these forces might try to return. He recommended we keep the house constantly blessed, and that I continue wearing the protection amulet. My grandmother, always so faithful, agreed, but I could feel that fear still accompanied her. In the weeks that followed, peace reigned in the house. For the first time in a long time, I managed to sleep without startling, and the days passed without the strange events that were previously part of my routine. However, something inside me remained restless. The words of Mrs. Sullivan and Reverend Thomas echoed in my mind. The mark I carried, an inheritance from my mother, connected me to that shadow world, and I couldn't convince myself that it was truly over. One night, while alone in my room, I decided to open an old wooden box where my grandmother kept the photograph of my mother. Rummaging through it, I found objects I had never seen before: a rosary of black beads, a small notebook full of mysterious symbols, and a letter addressed to my grandmother. When I opened it, I recognized my mother's handwriting. In the letter, she described how she had tried to protect me before disappearing. She confessed that in a desperate attempt to save my father, she had resorted to obscure practices. According to her, the doctors had no solution, and someone offered her an alternative, but at a high cost. My father died shortly after, and the consequences of this pact began to pursue her. That's why she decided to entrust me to my grandparents, trusting that their faith would be enough to protect me. What chilled me was reading that my mother knew I had inherited her gift, the ability to see and feel what others couldn't. In the letter, she implored that I never use this gift and that I stay away from that shadow world, as these abilities were exactly what the malevolent entities sought to exploit. Even without fully understanding what she described, those words confirmed everything Mrs. Sullivan and Reverend Thomas had said. After reading the letter, a sensation of oppression took over my chest, as if something invisible was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. That night, while sleeping, I had a dream so vivid it seemed real. I saw my mother at the foot of my bed. She remained silent, but her eyes were full of sadness. She extended her hand to me, and the instant I tried to touch her, I woke up startled. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but there was something different in the room. I didn't see shadows, but the air seemed heavier, charged. I felt she was trying to alert me about something I couldn't understand. The next day, I told my grandmother about the items in the box and the dream. Her concern increased, but she said little, only asking that I not mention anything to Mrs. Sullivan or Reverend Thomas, as if she feared they knew something that should remain hidden. That same day, we went to church for a special mass in memory of my grandfather. During the ceremony, I again felt like I was being watched. When I looked to the back of the church, I saw a figure almost hidden among the shadows. It was the small being with the same malicious smile. My heart raced, but when I blinked, it had disappeared. We returned home with a whirlwind of emotions. I wasn't sure if I should tell my grandmother what I had seen, but I decided to keep it to myself. Later, while praying in my room, I heard the distant sound of the bell again. Something inside me said this wasn't over, that the forces around us were waiting for the right moment to attack again. The following days were tense. Despite trying to distract myself, The constant sensation of being watched didn't disappear. The nights were even worse. Although the figures and shadows were no longer visible, I felt their presence in the corners of the house. My grandmother also seemed to perceive it, though she wouldn't admit it. Her way of praying had changed. It was more intense, almost desperate. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard the familiar creaking of the closet. My body stiffened, and for an instant I thought about calling my grandmother, but something made me stop. I felt that this time I needed to face whatever was in my room. I got up slowly, clutching the amulet around my neck, and approached the closet. When I opened the door, at first I only felt the unbearable cold, but then from the dark depths, the small being emerged. Its smile was more sinister, and in its hands it held a small, antique mirror. It raised the mirror, and my reflection began to distort within the glass. I felt as if something was pulling me inside, as if my own image was being sucked in. I tried to back away, but it was as if my body was trapped. Suddenly, a loud sound came from the bedroom door. It was my grandmother, realizing something was wrong. She entered carrying a blessed candle in one hand and the large wooden cross in the other. Upon seeing the small being, she began to pray with determination. But this time it didn't retreat. It seemed stronger, as if it had gained power over time. The mirror in the creature's hands began to emit a pale glow, and immediately my strength waned. My grandmother, perceiving my state, ran to me and pressed the cross against my chest. The contact with the wood brought a warmth that gave me enough energy to move away from the closet. At that moment, the small being let out a penetrating scream that resonated throughout the house, while my grandmother continued praying fervently. The creature disappeared into the mirror, which fell to the floor and shattered into thousands of fragments. Despite its absence, we knew the danger still lurked. My grandmother, exhausted, was panting, and I was trembling with fear. We decided to call Mrs. Sullivan immediately. When she arrived, she analyzed the shards of the mirror and confirmed our suspicions. That object was a portal, a direct connection to the world of shadows. Mrs. Sullivan insisted that we needed to perform one final ritual to definitively seal any remaining connection with these forces. She warned us, however, that this ritual wouldn't be easy. We would have to confront, once and for all, the entities that haunted us. My grandmother agreed without hesitation, and I, though terrified, knew there was no alternative. The following night, in our house's backyard, everything was prepared. Mrs. Sullivan drew a circle of salt and ashes around us, positioning black candles at each point. Holding the amulet that belonged to my mother, she began to chant prayers in an unknown language. The air became dense, and an icy wind blew, extinguishing the candles one by one. Then it appeared again. The small being was back, but this time accompanied by larger shadows that filled the yard with their oppressive presence. Mrs. Sullivan intensified the prayers, and my grandmother and I joined her, holding hands tightly. The shadows charged against the circle, but the barrier of salt and ashes kept them at a distance. The small being approached, stopping at the edge of the circle, holding what appeared to be a fragment of the broken mirror. It raised the piece and began to recite words in a strange and somber language. The shadows around it agitated violently, and I noticed that the protection surrounding us began to weaken. Mrs. Sullivan, with an even firmer voice, raised my mother's amulet and pronounced one final, powerful prayer. An intense light emerged from the circle, illuminating everything around. The shadows contorted, blinded, while the small being screamed with hatred before completely disappearing. When the light dissipated, the yard was immersed in silence. The shadows had vanished, and the fragment of the mirror that the being held had turned to ashes. Exhausted but relieved, Mrs. Sullivan confirmed that the ritual had been a success. However, she reminded us that my connection to the spiritual world would remain. She said I would have this sensitivity forever, but as long as I stayed away from obscure practices, I could live a relatively peaceful life. That night, my grandmother and I embraced tightly, aware that we had faced something that almost destroyed us, but also conscious that we had won together, thanks to faith and courage. In the weeks that followed, the house breathed a peace I hadn't experienced in years. Everything seemed different, as if the home had recovered its essence. My grandmother and I returned to our routine, but with the certainty that we would never be the same. Every corner of the house held the marks of what we had faced, but also a feeling of victory. Mrs. Sullivan continued to visit us, inspecting the amulets and reinforcing the protections, ensuring that the balance achieved was maintained. Despite everything seemingly having ended, something inside me remained restless. The shadows had disappeared, and the small being no longer manifested, but I still felt echoes of the past, a kind of subtle remnant of what had occurred. I didn't tell my grandmother anything to spare her from worries. I decided that if something were to happen again, I would face it alone. One day, while helping my grandmother clean the house, I found an object I had almost forgotten: the small notebook with symbols that had belonged to my mother. As I leafed through it, I saw drawings and notes written in a language I didn't recognize, interspersed with passages in English. Some spoke of protection and balance, while others mentioned sacrifices and pacts, which gave me chills. Amid the pages, one name was repeated several times: Azrael. My curiosity led me to ask Mrs. Sullivan about it. She explained only that it was a deity outside our Christian beliefs, but didn't go into details. According to her, my mother had sought help from this entity, although the exact reason remained obscure. This discovery awakened in me a mixture of admiration and fear regarding my mother. Although she had made serious mistakes, I began to understand that her choices were often motivated by love and desperation. I decided to keep the notebook, maintaining its contents secret. I knew it symbolized a powerful connection with my mother, but also a door to something I wasn't yet prepared to face. I hid it in a safe place, away from the eyes of my grandmother or anyone else. With time, I returned to school and strived to lead an ordinary life. I made some friends, but never shared what I had experienced. Many in town already knew rumors about our family, and I preferred not to fuel more stories. Still, there were days when this normalcy seemed fragile, like a mask about to fall. I knew my spiritual sensitivity would never completely disappear, and that at any moment I could go back to feeling what I had so feared. One night, I had another dream about my mother. This time, she wasn't standing at the foot of the bed, but sitting beside me, as if wanting to comfort me. In the dream, she held my hand and said something I never forgot. I will always be with you, but don't let my past define you. You have the power to decide who you want to be." Upon waking, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was the last time I dreamed of her. Years passed, and although I still carry this connection to the spiritual world, I learned to live with it. My grandmother continued to be my greatest source of support, praying for me and teaching me to face adversities. Mrs. Sullivan became more than a spiritual guide. She transformed into a great friend for us. I chose not to follow in my mother's footsteps, even knowing I had inherited her gift. I understood that my path didn't have to be the same. Instead, I focused on building a life away from the chaos that marked my childhood. I found comfort in the faith my grandmother cultivated in me, and also in my inner strength. Today, looking back at the past, I recognize that each experience, however frightening it may have been, helped shape who I am. The shadows, the small being, and all the challenges taught me to value life and the people around me. Although my journey has been difficult, I found peace in accepting my identity and taking the reins of my own destiny. My name is Marcus. I was 36 years old when I experienced something that completely transformed my perception of the supernatural. Until then, ghost stories seemed like just that, stories. But when you face something unexplainable personally, everything takes on an entirely different dimension. This happened about 8 years ago. I was working as a night security guard at an old hospital that had been converted into a medical records archive on the outskirts of Boston. The building was 5 stories high with a basement, but most of the activity was restricted to the ground floor, where the reception area and most frequently accessed files were kept. All entrances were secured with heavy doors, fitted with electronic locks and alarm systems. Any unauthorized attempt to open them would trigger both a silent alarm to the security company and an ear-splitting siren on site, making the place virtually impenetrable. It was precisely because of this security that what happened that night affected me so deeply. I would make rounds throughout the building, even though it wasn't strictly necessary, just to pass the time and keep myself awake during the long midnight shift. Usually, I'd walk through the dimly lit corridors, listening to podcasts or checking news on my phone when my portable charger had enough juice. The upper floors were particularly eerie, with long hallways of abandoned patient rooms, now storing boxes of medical histories dating back decades. That night, I was returning from the 4th floor, where I'd gone to check on a window that security sensors indicated might be unlocked. As I stepped out of the stairwell onto the 3rd floor, I froze completely. There she was, standing motionless in the middle of the hallway, as if waiting for me to appear. A young woman. I stood paralyzed. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to be inside the building, especially not someone like her. She wore what looked like surgical scrubs, light blue top and pants, but they were completely soaked with a dark red liquid that could only be blood. Her body was covered with what appeared to be deep lacerations. My heart raced violently, but I managed to grab my radio and, without taking my eyes off her, called for backup, reporting the situation and requesting an ambulance. As I did this, my hands trembled so badly that I dropped both my keys and radio on the floor. When I bent down to retrieve them, I noticed with a chill crawling up my spine that she was now just inches away from me. Her presence felt suffocating, as if the air around me had become thicker and harder to breathe. I could only see her feet bare and covered in blood, yet perfectly still. I couldn't comprehend how she had moved so quickly across more than 20 feet without making a single sound. I remained frozen, then watched as her feet slowly began to back away. When I finally summoned the courage to stand up, I looked around and she was gone. I checked the floor for any trace of blood or footprints, but there was nothing, not a single drop or smudge. Over the radio, my colleagues were asking me to unlock the front entrance since the police were on their way. But no ambulance could get through because of a massive accident that had blocked off the surrounding streets. I responded that it was no longer necessary. I didn't explain what had happened. I was too confused and terrified. To this day, I'm not sure exactly what I saw in that hallway. I returned to my small security booth near the entrance, and my colleague on the radio suggested I step outside to be visible to the officers, making it easier for them to find the building amid the commotion. I did as he suggested, unlocking the heavy front doors and stepping out into the cold October air. Outside, just a few hundred yards down the street near the intersection, there was a crowd gathered around something. Still shaken and with no desire to remain alone inside the building, I approached to see what was happening. That's when I saw her again. There she was, the same woman I had encountered in the hallway minutes before, now lying motionless on the asphalt. They hadn't covered her body with the white sheet typically used for those who have passed yet. It was undeniably her. The same face, the same hair, the same build. Only now she was completely soaked in blood, her surgical scrubs torn and mangled. From what I gathered from the officers at the scene, she had been a resident doctor rushing to an emergency call when her car was struck by a speeding truck. The impact had thrown her through the windshield. I still wonder how I didn't hear anything. I was so close. Perhaps the thick walls of the old hospital building had muffled the sound. Or maybe I was too absorbed in my podcast. But none of that explains how she appeared to me inside the building, when she was clearly already deceased outside on the street. To this day, I cannot comprehend what happened. Beyond the shock, I felt a profound sadness. I can't imagine what she experienced in those final moments. And although I was terrified, I don't believe her intention in appearing before me was to frighten me. It was that night I understood through personal experience what it means to see a ghost. Around here, we hear many stories about crisis apparitions, tragic events marked by unexpected goodbyes. They say these phenomena occur when the soul, or whatever remains of someone's essence, attempts to interact with the physical world in their final moments. We commonly hear that these apparitions appear to people close to the deceased, either to say a final goodbye or to convey some message. But what about when they appear to a complete stranger? Is it an act of desperation? Do they seek out anyone, any person at all, to witness their pain or their final moments? Sometimes I wonder if she was confused, if in those last seconds between life and death, she thought she was still rushing through the hospital halls to save someone else's life. Or perhaps she was trying to save her own. Whatever the reason, her appearance changed me forever. I no longer work night shifts, and I avoid hospitals completely. But most importantly, I no longer dismiss the stories others tell about encounters with the unexplainable, because now I have my own story, one that I can't explain, but I know with absolute certainty to be true. Sometimes at night, I still dream of her standing in that hallway, and I wake up wondering if there was something I could have done, some message I was supposed to receive or pass on. But like the accident that took her life so suddenly, some questions simply have no answers. They just leave marks on us that, like scars, fade but never completely disappear. In the winter of 2004, I worked as a security guard at Pinewood Memorial Hospital on the outskirts of Portland, Maine. The hospital was an imposing structure dating back to the 1920s, with numerous renovations and expansions over the decades that created a maze-like interior of old wings connecting to newer sections. My job involved 24-hour shifts, which left me alone during those quiet hours when the daytime bustle subsided and the hospital settled into its nighttime routine. With most doors locked and only a skeleton crew of night nurses and doctors on duty, I often found myself wandering the dim corridors, checking doors and making sure everything was secure. It was during one of these frigid January nights that we received an emergency admission. A young woman had been involved in a serious snowmobile accident in the remote woods outside town. The paramedics rushed her in with multiple injuries covering her body, but two were particularly life-threatening. Severe head trauma causing significant brain injury and a spinal fracture that had left her paralyzed from the shoulders down. The doctors weren't optimistic about her chances, but they worked tirelessly to stabilize her condition. Due to ongoing renovations in the ICU wing, she was placed in an isolated room in the East Corridor, an older section of the hospital that housed only a few patients at any given time. This area became part of my regular patrol route. About 3 nights after her admission, around 2 in the morning, I noticed a young woman wandering near the vending machines in the cafeteria area. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and a pale complexion. "Excuse me," I called out. "Can I help you find something? The main entrance is locked at this hour." She turned to me with a slight smile. "I'm just looking for the exit. The side doors seem to be locked too." I explained that I could escort her to the emergency room exit, which remained accessible at all hours. As we walked, she mentioned wanting to buy a bottle of water. There was a small convenience shop near the ER waiting area that was still open, so I accompanied her there. While she selected her water, we chatted briefly. She explained that she was here taking care of the snowmobile accident victim because the family lived several hours away and couldn't stay overnight. "That's very kind of you," I remarked. "Are you a close friend?" "You could say that," she replied with a distant look in her eyes. "We've known each other our whole lives." The explanation seemed reasonable. In our rural community, people often stepped up to help in times of crisis, even if they weren't immediate family. I didn't press for details about visitation protocols or question how she was allowed in after hours. The night shift nurses often bent rules for family and close friends of critically ill patients. For the next several nights, our encounters continued. Sometimes I would see her wandering the halls or sitting in the dimly lit waiting area. Other times, I'd glimpse an older woman instead, perhaps in her 50s, who I assumed was taking turns with the younger woman in keeping vigil. Our conversations never delved too deep, mostly limited to pleasantries about the bitter Maine weather or comments about the antique architecture of the hospital. One thing I found odd was that neither of them ever seemed to be carrying any personal belongings. No purse, no coat despite the freezing temperatures, no phone. But working nights in a hospital, you encounter all sorts of unusual behavior from people under stress, so I didn't think much of it. 19 days after the accident victim was admitted, my shift was particularly quiet. Around 3 in the morning, an announcement came over my radio that a code blue was being called in the East Wing. I rushed over, but by the time I arrived, the medical team was already stepping back, their faces somber. Despite their best efforts, the young woman had succumbed to her injuries. As part of hospital protocol for nighttime deaths, I was tasked with helping prepare the paperwork and assisting with the initial arrangements until the funeral home could arrive in the morning. The doctor pulled back the sheet to confirm identity for the records, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The face that looked up at me, now still and peaceful in death, was unmistakably that of the young woman I had been speaking with in the corridors. The same auburn hair, now matted against the pillow, the same delicate features. For several long seconds, I couldn't breathe. When I finally found my voice, I asked the doctor if the patient had any siblings. No, he replied, checking the chart. Only child. Just her parents listed as next of kin. They're driving in from New Hampshire, should be here by morning. Later that night, I pored over the security footage from the past 2 weeks, searching every camera angle of the corridors and cafeteria during my shifts. To my shock, on each occasion when I distinctly remembered speaking with either the young woman or the older one, the footage showed me standing alone, apparently talking to empty space. The woman I had escorted through the halls, the one who had bought water and discussed the weather with me night after night, had never left her hospital bed. She had been paralyzed, unconscious, and fighting for her life the entire time, even as her spirit, or something that looked exactly like her, walked the corridors beside me. I never shared what happened with her parents when they arrived the next morning, grief-stricken and exhausted from their drive. It wasn't the time or place, but I did learn one final detail that made the hair on my neck stand on end. The older woman I had occasionally seen instead of the younger one was, according to a photo on the father's phone, the spitting image of the patient's mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer. I left that job at Pinewood Memorial 3 months later, but what happened during those winter nights has stayed with me for over 20 years. In the stillness of certain nights, I sometimes wonder if she knew, if some part of her consciousness was aware that she was showing me what waited on the other side. And I wonder about that older woman too, who had perhaps come to guide her daughter home. There are stories that touch us deeply even before we know all the details. Some resonate because of the mystery they contain, others because of the emotions hidden between the lines. The account I'm about to share came to me with a sensation I cannot ignore, that it carries truths as frightening as they are beautiful. My name is Aliner, and today I want to share some curious situations I experienced in my father-in-law's house. I'll call him Walter. From the moment I started dating his son Mason, I noticed Walter was a reserved man who spoke little and spent most of his time working in his woodshop attached to his home. According to Mason, that's where he spent nearly every waking hour. When Mason and I married, Walter didn't attend our wedding despite my attempts to include him. He apologized and explained he didn't think it appropriate to come. I was deeply saddened, especially since I no longer had my parents, and Mason only had him as close family. Perhaps his absence was due to the complicated relationship he maintained with Mason. They barely spoke, and I remember it wasn't easy convincing my husband to introduce me to his father. For me, it was important to know the family of the man with whom I was building a life. I quickly realized that both Mason and his brother had little connection with Walter. I encouraged my husband to reconnect, but he seemed unwilling and always ignored my suggestions. I often saw a melancholic expression on Walter's face, but he never commented on it. He seemed resigned to the emotional distance between them. One of the rare moments I saw my father-in-law show enthusiasm was when my son Connor was born, his first grandchild. Even while I was still pregnant, he showed concern and joy. At first, he seemed somewhat shy, almost as if he didn't know how to interact, so I made a point of visiting him frequently with Connor. During these visits, he showed tremendous affection for his grandson. He would sit beside the rocking chair when the little one slept, loved holding him, and smiled seeing Connor play with his glasses. However, when Connor was only 3 months old, we needed to move to another town since Mason received a good job offer. Although it was a joint decision, I felt terrible about the impact it would have on my father-in-law. On my last visit before we moved, I went alone. Mason preferred not to go, and I decided not to insist. Walter was visibly emotional during our goodbye, almost in tears. I told him he could visit us anytime, since our new house was only 40 minutes away. Still, he had a desolate look in his eyes. Unfortunately, after our move, he never came to visit us, and phone contact was also rare. Walter lived alone and eventually disconnected his landline when he moved to a more isolated area. I felt great affection for him. Without my parents, he was a figure of respect and kindness in my life. Because of this, I made a point of bringing Connor to see him whenever possible. However, gradually, the hustle of daily life consumed me, and visits became more sporadic. Additionally, Mason never offered to go with me, and I didn't feel safe driving alone with my son. It seemed risky. About a year after our move, my father-in-law fell unexpectedly ill. It was a shock to both Mason and me, since Walter had always been in exemplary health and took good care of his diet. As a woodworker, he spent most of his day in his workshop. One morning, a neighbor called to tell us he had fainted and fallen in front of his house. We rushed to see him and found a clearly worn-out man. His body revealed accumulated fatigue, a weary face, sad eyes, and evident weight loss compared to months before. It was difficult not to notice that he had been feeling unwell for some time, even though he denied it and insisted everything was under control. I resumed visiting him frequently, bringing food and sometimes my son to brighten the atmosphere a bit. Mason appeared rarely, always using work as an excuse. To me, it seemed just that, an excuse. Walter, on the other hand, looked increasingly frail. His deep dark circles showed sleepless nights. The house had also changed. It was darker, with an unpleasant smell and an oppressive feeling in the air, as if ventilation simply no longer circulated. My son Connor began exhibiting curious behavior. He would stare at specific points of open doorways, following something with his eyes as if someone were moving. This made me uncomfortable. One afternoon, while Walter was in his workshop, Connor played in the living room as I watched from the kitchen. Suddenly, he began to laugh, as if interacting with someone. Shortly after, he started crying, and when I picked him up, his body was rigid with tension. I tried to convince myself it was just the vivid imagination of a small child, but the situation disturbed me. In a conversation with Mason, I mentioned his father's health. Without wanting to sound like I was complaining, I suggested he pay more attention to his father. I couldn't understand the distance between him and his brother. It was as if they simply ignored what was happening. I continued visiting Walter and caring for him as best I could, but my routine with Connor, who was growing, made it increasingly difficult. During another visit, I noticed some injuries on Walter's face and arms. He explained he had fallen off his bicycle. In the days that followed, I was the one who cared for him. Although the accident wasn't serious, his fragility required rest. Walter, despite insisting he knew how to take care of himself, seemed grateful for the support. It was then that I noticed something strange on the walls of the house. Black spots began to appear, small at first and easy to ignore. Over time, they grew, taking forms that resembled spider webs in a grayish tone that gradually darkened. Walter attributed the problem to moisture, and the smell reinforced this explanation, so I preferred not to give it much attention. With my busy routine, I didn't have time to cook, so Mason gave me money to buy meals for his father. Despite this, Walter barely touched the food. He explained one day that he simply didn't feel hungry. I had a copy of the house key, but out of respect, always knocked before entering. Sometimes he opened the door, other times I let myself in. Once, as I closed the door behind me, something caught my attention. A shadow moved near the sofa, as if someone were hiding there. The house was well lit, and it was mid-afternoon. I approached slowly, but there was nothing behind the sofa. I felt uneasy. What I saw seemed to be a small figure, perhaps a child, but I decided to believe it might have just been the shadow of the door. On another occasion, while washing dishes in the kitchen, Connor had stayed home with his father. I had a clear view of the woodshop in the backyard through the window. When I looked up, I saw something that made me freeze. Standing next to the workshop was a boy with his back to me. His black hair and height indicated he must have been about 6 years old. He looked around as if searching for something, moving his head from side to side until he crouched among the plants. I felt a chill run down my spine, along with a heavy pressure in my chest, an inexplicable fear. Shortly after, the boy entered the workshop. It took a lot of courage, but despite my fear, I went out to the yard. When I pushed the door open, the environment was empty. The smell of wood and varnish filled the small space, where tables and unfinished toys were scattered. There was no sign of anyone. I barely stayed. I took a quick look, and returned to the house with my body trembling. The image of that boy remained clear in my mind. As time passed, Walter began complaining about things disappearing. Tools and personal items were mysteriously vanishing. He mentioned he had lost a solid gold rosary just a few days before. According to him, it was an item pawned to him, but the owner never returned to claim it. We searched the entire house and found nothing. While helping with the search, I noticed something strange. Mold stains had begun to spread. They were on the furniture, in the kitchen, and especially in Walter's bedroom near the bed. The dark green mold made the air heavy. I tried to rationalize, thinking it could just be a humidity problem, but the discomfort persisted. I asked my father-in-law if anyone else frequented the house. He explained that besides me, only a young woman came occasionally, but it had been quite some time since her last visit, perhaps because she was busy. I commented that she might have found or stored the rosary somewhere else. I even suggested she might have stolen it. Walter, however, defended that she was trustworthy and noted my suspicion. He described the rosary in rich detail, mentioning that he planned to give it as a gift to Connor. Although he showed sadness over the loss, he quickly minimized it, saying it doesn't matter anymore. As the days passed, Walter began showing signs of improvement, although he was still visibly weak. Whenever I found him in the workshop, he was busy creating toys for Connor, even though my grandson was too young to play with them. The colors caught his attention. Walter said this way, Connor would have something to remember him by in the future. One day, I went to the workshop to observe closely how he worked. That space felt different, almost welcoming, especially compared to the heavy atmosphere in the rest of the house. Walter, I don't want to be intrusive, but don't you think the house seems different lately? I asked. He took several seconds to respond. The spots on the walls don't worry you, I insisted. Maybe it's because I haven't been cleaning properly, he said. As soon as I can, I'll take care of it. I preferred not to push further. After all, he knew his own house better than I did. However, I wasn't convinced. I thought about telling him about the boy I'd seen, but feared frightening him. Instead, I suggested he come live with us for a while to recover. He, however, firmly refused. This is my home, and I'm happy here. Walter insisted that he would be fine soon, but I couldn't ignore the weight the house seemed to have on him. It was as if the smell of illness filled the air, even though doctors assured us he just needed rest and medication. I believed getting him out of that environment might help him. I spoke with Mason and proposed we hire someone to care for his father, since my routine prevented me from visiting as often as I would have liked. I asked him to speak with Derek, his brother, so they could organize something together. I made a point of emphasizing that it wasn't just for my peace of mind, but because Walter truly needed his sons. I decided to stop bringing Connor to his grandfather's house. My son no longer seemed comfortable there. He cried without reason and only wanted to be in my arms. Additionally, I worried he might get sick because of the humidity. This clearly affected Walter, though he didn't say anything, but it was visible in his eyes how much he missed his grandson. At the same time, I hoped this might convince him to accept our help. Once, Walter suddenly asked me if I also smelled fried apples throughout the house. That caught me by surprise, because the odor I detected was something rotten, almost putrid. Taking advantage of his resting in his room, I decided to clean the house. Walter didn't like me taking care of chores, sometimes even complaining, but I resolved to act anyway. I opened all the doors and windows, letting the air circulate. The natural light brought a certain lightness to the environment, but the house still felt oppressive. While cleaning, I looked for the source of the bad smell, thinking it might be some dead animal hidden somewhere. I was in one of the back bedrooms, sweeping, when I passed the broom under the bed and felt it hit something. I imagined it might be a box. I passed the broom again, and the object was still there, impeding movement. I bent down to check, but what I saw made me freeze. A child was huddled in a corner under the bed. A scream escaped my throat, and I stood up with difficulty, my heart racing. I went into the hallway, trying to understand what was happening. The boy remained there, looking at me with wide, attentive eyes. I took a step toward the door, but nervousness made me retreat. I wanted to cry. Fear took over me. I went to my father-in-law's room. He was sleeping deeply, oblivious to what was happening. I gathered courage and returned to the room where I had seen the boy. My hands trembled as I passed the broom under the bed again, expecting to feel the same obstacle. This time it slid without resistance. Slowly I bent down to look, but the space was empty. There was nothing there anymore. It was as if all energy had been sucked out of me. I began to pray, repeating the Lord's Prayer. I was certain it was the same boy I had seen near the woodshop. It couldn't just be coincidence. I closed the bedroom door and went to the kitchen, trying to calm myself. There was a knot in my throat as I desperately sought a logical explanation, but couldn't find one. How could a child appear and disappear like that? The image of the boy with those bright eyes under the bed wouldn't leave my head. I thought about waking Walter, but what would I say? That I had seen a child in the house. He would certainly think I was crazy. I resolved to remain silent, trying to believe it was all just a product of my imagination, perhaps provoked by the heaviness of that environment. In the following days, the scene continued to disturb me. The next week, during another visit, my uneasiness was evident. Despite trying to disguise it, Walter noticed and asked if something had happened. I denied it and quickly changed the subject, asking how he was doing. We sat in silence for a good while at the kitchen table. He didn't touch his food, just stared into nothingness, as if deciding whether or not to tell me something. I feared he might insist on knowing the reason for my disturbance. Suddenly, he broke the silence. "How is my son?" I was surprised because we rarely talked about Mason, and only when I brought up the subject. "He's fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Does he ask about me?" His voice came out hesitant, laden with emotion. I swallowed hard and answered yes, but it was a lie. Mason didn't ask about his father. At that moment, I didn't have the courage to tell the truth, seeing the state Walter was in, but from his look, I knew he didn't believe me. "You don't need to come here just to take care of me. It's not necessary, really." His face began to turn red and his voice trembled. "It's no trouble at all, Walter. You're like a second father to me," and I spoke the truth. From the beginning, he welcomed me as part of the family. Despite his gruff manner, I learned to see that this was how he showed care. "I think I failed with my children," he said, lowering his eyes. "I wasn't present when they needed me most, and that hurts me deeply." His voice broke, and my chest tightened with his words. I couldn't respond. I remained silent, feeling that weight hit me too. I tried to win them over in so many ways, but I always failed. I made many mistakes, and I don't blame them for that. They have every right. Guilt showed through in every word, and I felt his pain as if it were my own. As Walter spoke, almost crying, my mind returned to so many moments when he tried to get closer. He always did it carefully, as if he needed his son's approval to talk to me or to see his grandson. I also began to better understand Mason's side. Walter had abandoned his and Derek's mother, and after her death, he tried to return to repair his mistakes. But it was too late, and the two sons didn't want to reconnect. It was a story full of hurt. Mason hated touching on this subject, and I avoided it too, because I knew how much it filled the house with resentment. Looking at Walter in that condition, so fragile and tired, was heartbreaking. I had witnessed his reconciliation attempts, and he never stopped trying. At the same time, I couldn't help thinking about how I would give anything to have my parents back, to have had my father walk me down the aisle, or my mother celebrating with me at my wedding. I never knew if they would be proud of me, but I like to imagine they would be. I couldn't have that, and seeing Mason wasting the chance to rebuild a relationship with his living father troubled me. Walter was there, trying to correct the past, and my husband simply didn't see the value in that. Suddenly, Walter began to cry softly, until the tears broke loose completely. It was difficult to see him like this. I stood up and hugged him. His body seemed so fragile, so light. I told him I loved him, and that I was very grateful for everything he did for us. He cried like a child, breaking down in my arms. The next day, I gathered the courage to talk to Mason. I was worried about his father, but didn't know how to approach the subject. After much thought, I risked it. "I think you should visit your father." He didn't respond, as if he hadn't even heard me. I insisted, but he just muttered that he didn't have time. That work was taking over everything and ended the conversation. That night, I couldn't hold back and brought up the subject again. I felt a tightness in my chest, a presentiment that wouldn't leave me in peace. "Mason, you need to make peace with your father." Silence. Mason didn't respond, and I also kept quiet. I took a deep breath and insisted, "I'm serious. He's very ill, and I really fear something might happen to him." The next day, Mason finally said he would visit him and asked if I wanted to go along. During the journey, my anxiety grew. When we arrived, Walter was disconcerted. It was obvious he wasn't expecting the visit. Still, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: sincere happiness on his face. He was radiant, even if nervous. Mason spoke little, while Walter, on the other hand, couldn't stop. He rubbed his hands together, casting quick glances from one side to the other, as if gauging how much each word meant. On the way back, Mason broke the silence. "The house seems strange." He commented on the dark spots on the walls and the heavy feeling the environment brought. He said he hadn't visited the house in a long time and was disturbed by what he saw. During the rest of the trip, he remained quiet. Later, when we were in bed, he confessed in a low tone, "I didn't think he was that sick." I heard in Mason's voice a mixture of fear and regret. There was a silence, and then I heard Mason crying. It was rare to see him like this, but the loneliness of his father in that house seemed to finally reach him. I suggested we invite Walter to stay with us for a few days. I didn't want a pressure, but Mason agreed. Walter came to our house on 2 occasions, and the change seemed to do him good. Gradually, his gaze regained a sparkle I hadn't seen in a long time. He continued bringing handmade toys for Connor. Each time he appeared with a different one. The last was a wooden car painted blue. Shortly after, my father-in-law passed away. It was unexpected, even more so because he seemed to be improving. I don't want to go into details, but I was the one who found him. I went to pick him up for lunch with us. I rang the doorbell, and he didn't answer. I used the spare key to enter and found him lying in bed, his skin with a pale bluish tone. When I touched him, he was ice cold. I broke down crying right there. Days before, he had seemed so well, even playing with his grandson. And then suddenly, he was gone. The loss was difficult for everyone, especially for Mason. He began to blame himself, repeating that he should have been more present. I did my best to console him. You were with him in his last days, and that was surely all he needed. I remembered Walter's illuminated face while he was in our house. There was no use looking for someone to blame. It was better to hold onto the good memories we built together. Somehow it seemed Walter knew his days were numbered. What surprised me most was Derek, my brother-in-law, who didn't appear at his own father's funeral. He kept his distance, and we respected that. Neither Mason nor I insisted. After the funeral came the revelation of the will. Walter left the house to me. At first, I didn't believe it, but it was true. It was a shock. I thought it should belong to his sons, but Mason convinced me it was his father's wish, and it was our duty to respect it. A few days later, Mason asked me for the keys to go to the house. He didn't invite me to go along. He seemed to want to be alone. When he returned, he was pale, frightened. He said only, "I saw my brother in my father's house." I thought he was talking about Derek, but he quickly clarified he wasn't talking about his older brother, but the one who had died when Mason was still a child. I already knew this story, but I had never heard much about it, and there weren't even photos. The description Mason gave, however, matched the boy I had also seen in that house, the same one who appeared under the bed. My husband recounted that, upon entering the house, he was greeted by the same moldy smell as before. He noticed that the dark spots on the walls were stronger, almost dominating the place. He tried to ignore it and went to the backyard, to the wood shop. Inside, everything seemed normal at first glance, except for the unfinished furniture that Walter had left. On top of one of the tables was a small wooden chair that would probably have been a gift for Connor. Mason said he turned his face toward a corner and saw the boy standing there. He trembled as he told me, his eyes wide, still terrified by the memory. The boy was motionless, his back against the wall, looking at him. Mason shouted and took a step back, thinking it might be an illusion, but the figure slowly tilted its head to the side. It was enough to make him run out of the workshop. He knew that couldn't be real. The image of the boy haunted him. Mason had few memories of his brother since he was very young when he died, but he never forgot his face, and at that moment he swore it was him. That left me paralyzed. I told Mason that I had also seen the boy several times, but always attributed it to fatigue or stress. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. That night, I suggested we pray together. I was already accustomed to praying every night for Walter. This time, we did it for both souls and lit a candle. It was then that the dreams began. In the dreams, I was always in my father-in-law's house, searching for Connor through the rooms, but unable to find him. Suddenly, a shadow would appear and begin to follow me. It was the boy's. Curiously, I didn't feel afraid of him. It seemed somehow that he was trying to guide me, as if wanting to protect me from something worse that was there. In the end, I would leave the house and go to the garden. There, the boy's shadow would disappear, but another figure would emerge, motionless near the workshop. I never saw its face, but I had the strong feeling it was Walter. I would wake up in the middle of the night, breathless and scared. I told Mason about the dreams, and he thought perhaps it was his father trying to send me a message. A few days later, I had another dream. This time I was in the woodshop. The figure was holding a small wooden box, hand-painted. I don't remember the exact colors, but there was a rose drawn on it. I woke up confused, not understanding the meaning of this. The dreams began to repeat, and Mason became concerned. He suggested we go to the house to try to understand what was happening. We went one afternoon after he got off work. While he stayed in the car with Connor, I entered the yard and went straight to the workshop. That had always been my favorite place in the house, because it conveyed a tranquility that the other rooms didn't have. I began to search, trying to guide myself by the blurred image from the dream. The rose was my only clue. I searched the tables, the tools, but found nothing. I reached the corner of the workshop, where Mason said he had seen the figure. There were pieces of wood blocking the passage. It was then that I noticed something hidden in the corner. It wasn't a small box, but a wooden rocking horse with a rose painted on the side. I moved the wood pieces to reach it. It was larger than I had imagined and quite heavy. I realized it opened from the inside, so I opened it. The contents fell to the floor, and my heart raced. It was gold. Chains, rings, and other jewels sparkled there, as if they had just been polished. I was in shock. I ran out of the workshop and straight to the car. Mason looked at me, frightened, thinking I had seen the boy again. I asked him to come inside with me, insisting until he gave in. I showed him the horse and what was inside. We were perplexed, unable to understand where it all could have come from. Shortly after, I had my last dream with Walter. It was different from all the others, as if he were still alive. We were in his kitchen, and he was holding Connor in his arms. In the dream, Connor was still a baby of a few months, laughing happily while his grandfather caressed his head. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion, with Walter's face so clear it seemed real. I woke up with tears in my eyes. I told Mason about the dream, and he cried too. I felt it was a farewell. Walter was saying goodbye and perhaps thanking us. Despite the tears, I woke up with immense peace and a gentle warmth in my chest that spread throughout my body. We began to face problems with Derek, my brother-in-law, who didn't hide his discomfort at the fact that the house was in my name. What bothered me most wasn't the discussion about inheritance, but his hypocrisy. He had time to complain about it, but never appeared to visit his father, say goodbye, or show any interest in him. Derek even came to our house to talk. I listened to everything he said without responding, concerned about the heavy feeling that still pervaded my father-in-law's house. I asked the priest from the church I attended to go there and bless it. It seemed the place was disintegrating, as if being swallowed by its own energy. After the blessing, something changed. It was as if the windows had been opened, letting in the sun after a long time in the dark. Connor, my son, doesn't remember his grandfather since he was very young. Whenever I can, I tell him how much Walter loved him. Inside the wooden horse we found, there was a small chain with a cross-shaped pendant. On special occasions, I put the chain on Connor and tell him it was a gift from Grandpa, who protects him from heaven. Even without direct memories, Walter continues to be present in his life. The wooden toys Walter made are varnished and scattered throughout the house as small reminders of a dedicated grandfather. Walter left a very special place in my heart. He was the father I never had. Sometimes I cry thinking if I could have done more for him. But I know I will never fully know his story and the battles he faced. I imagine there came a moment when his body simply couldn't bear any more. For me, the mysteries of that house remain partially unsolved. I don't know who the child was that both Mason and I saw, though the most likely explanation is that it was indeed his deceased brother. I don't know where the gold came from, or why Walter hid it in that rocking horse. But I do know that in those last days, reconciliation brought peace not just to Walter, but to all of us. Sometimes the shadows we fear most are not ghosts from the past, but the regrets of what we failed to do in the present. I'll always remember this story from my grandfather, a retired sheriff who dedicated his entire life to upholding the law in our small Wyoming town. Having served for over 3 decades, he carries a collection of experiences, some hopeful, others haunting. When you wear the badge that long, you inevitably encounter every kind of situation imaginable. Among the countless stories he shared during our fireside talks, this one from the winter of 1973 has stayed with me the most. A tale both unusual and drenched in melancholy. He told me that one particularly bitter December night, while he was alone at the station during a snowstorm, the telephone rang, cutting through the silence. On the other end of the line was the gentle voice of a little boy, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The child spoke softly, almost whispering, asking for help for his sister. He said very little, only that she needed urgent help, that their parents were cruel, and he begged my grandfather to hurry. The call disconnected abruptly before he could get more details. But thankfully, they had just installed a new system that could trace local calls. Not knowing exactly what to expect, my grandfather and his deputy braved the worsening blizzard and drove to the isolated farmhouse located about 15 miles outside town. When they arrived, they found a dilapidated 2-story home with peeling paint and windows boarded up against the elements. The yard was buried under snow, but even through the white blanket, they could see it was littered with abandoned farm equipment and discarded household items. They knocked on the door, which creaked open just enough to reveal part of a man's face, gaunt, unshaven, with suspicious eyes. My grandfather explained the reason for their unexpected visit: an emergency call made by a child from this address. He requested permission to enter and verify the situation, but the man, visibly annoyed, responded curtly, "No boy lives here." Even with the resistance, the officers insisted, stating that if he didn't cooperate, they would return with a warrant, complicating matters further. Reluctantly, the man yielded. Inside the house, they found a woman sitting by a wood stove, knitting something small. The interior was as neglected as the exterior, wallpaper peeling, floorboards warped, and a pervasive chill that seemed to come from more than just the weather. When questioned, the couple confirmed they had only one child, a daughter, and claimed they had never had a son. The woman's eyes darted nervously to her husband with each question. My grandfather requested permission to examine the rooms, searching for any evidence of another child. The couple exchanged glances before the man gestured toward the stairs with obvious reluctance. In what appeared to be a child's bedroom upstairs, they discovered something alarming. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, was lying in bed, visibly injured with bruises on her face and arms. The neglect was evident. The room was freezing, with only a thin blanket covering her despite the sub-zero temperatures outside. The parents showed no concern when confronted, offering weak excuses about her falling down the stairs. After ensuring the girl's safety and following necessary protocols, my grandfather began investigating the mysterious call. This is where the story takes its most unsettling turn. According to the call log, the voice was indeed that of a young boy, but further inquiry revealed a chilling fact. The couple had indeed once had a son, a twin to the girl, who had died 3 winters earlier during another blizzard when he'd been locked in the unheated barn as punishment. The boy had frozen to death while the parents slept inside. What makes the situation even more enigmatic is that according to the records, it was the voice of the deceased boy himself who made the call to the police, pleading for help to save his twin sister before she met the same fate. This call remained recorded in the emergency archives, and my grandfather had the opportunity to listen to the recording repeatedly, confirming that it was indeed the voice of a young child, clear and desperate. The daughter, once recovered physically, revealed to social services that she often felt her brother's presence, especially on cold nights. She claimed he would sit at the foot of her bed and promised that someday he would find a way to get her out of that house. The night before the police arrived, she said she had dreamed of him standing by the old rotary phone in the hallway, dialing numbers with determined concentration. The old telephone in the farmhouse was examined and found to be disconnected, had been for months according to the service provider. Yet somehow the call had come through to the station, registered with that exact house's number. Years later, when the girl had grown into a woman with children of her own, she sought out my grandfather before he retired. She brought something with her, a small, worn photograph of 2 children standing together, holding hands. On the back, in childish handwriting, were the words, "I promised I'd find help." To this day, no one has found an explanation for what occurred that night, except perhaps something beyond natural understanding. The case remains confidential and was never disclosed publicly, nor should it be. Some mysteries, my grandfather would say with a distant look in his eyes, aren't meant to be solved, only respected. Sometimes, in the quiet hours when the wind howls around my own home, I wonder about that boy and the love that seemingly transcended death itself. I wonder what forces might exist in this world that we can't explain, forces that might, occasionally, reach across impossible divides when someone they love is in danger. After months of uncertainty and the constant encouragement from my friends, I finally decided to try an online dating platform. It had been a considerable time since my last relationship, and although I was skeptical about finding someone authentic through an app, the combination of loneliness and curiosity eventually convinced me to create a profile. After swiping through countless profiles, one stood out: Jonathan. His photo showed a man appearing to be in his late 30s, with piercing eyes and a subtle smile that immediately captured my interest. His description was brief but captivating, mentioning his passion for ancient literature and midnight walks through abandoned places. We began exchanging messages, and it quickly became clear there was something unique about him. Our conversations flowed in a fascinating way, and I found myself anxious to hear more of his ideas. After several days of messaging, he suggested we meet. We arranged to meet at an upscale speakeasy hidden beneath the streets of New Orleans, a city I'd only recently moved to after accepting a position at the university. On the evening of our date, I felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. I chose my favorite vintage dress and arrived at the location a few minutes before our agreed time. As I descended the narrow staircase into the dimly lit establishment, I spotted Jonathan at a table in the corner, calmly observing the other patrons. "I'm pleased you came," he said, rising to greet me with a delicate kiss on the cheek. His voice was low and entrancing, carrying a tone that seemed both comforting and unsettling simultaneously. The conversation began spontaneously and fluidly. We discussed our work, hobbies, and dreams, but there was something about Jonathan that remained shrouded in mystery, something his dark eyes seemed to guard like a well-protected secret. As our conversation continued, small details began to catch my attention. Whenever I asked about his personal life, his answers were vague, and he quickly shifted focus to more general topics. Despite this, his charisma was undeniable, and the more time we spent together, the more drawn to him I felt. As the night progressed, Jonathan proposed continuing our conversation at his residence. "I have an extraordinary collection of rare manuscripts I'd love to show you," he said, with a smile that radiated confidence. For a moment I hesitated. Some part of me suggested caution, but his magnetic presence was difficult to ignore. Curiosity won, and I accepted his invitation. We made our way to his residence, an antebellum mansion located in the Garden District. The place exuded an air of decadent history, with towering ceilings adorned with intricate moldings and walls lined with artifacts that seemed to predate the city itself. The soft amber light from vintage fixtures cast dancing shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between centuries. Jonathan served glasses of absinthe, an authentic preparation with a ritual that seemed practiced and precise. He handed me one, his fingers brushing against mine almost imperceptibly. I felt a shiver mixing excitement with a slight unease. As our conversation continued, Jonathan began speaking about his interest in mystical subjects like ancient rituals and forgotten knowledge. "There are things in this world that most people simply cannot perceive," he said, looking into my eyes with an intensity that left me speechless. Although his words caused me some apprehension, There was something in the tone of his voice and the way he spoke that kept me entranced. It was as if I were under some kind of spell, unable to look away from the enigmatic depth his eyes conveyed. The night continued to unfold, and the mystery surrounding Jonathan only intensified. Each time I tried to steer the conversation toward something lighter, he returned to subjects laden with shadows and enigmas. Instead of frightening me away, his intensity and fascination with the unknown captivated me even more. I don't remember the exact moment when Jonathan leaned forward slightly with that enigmatic smile and said, "I need to show you something. It will help you better understand what I am." My heart raced, seized by a disturbing mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Even with intuition urging caution, the force of the connection between us was impossible to ignore. He stood up and extended his hand, leading me to a door at the end of a poorly lit corridor. As we advanced, the air became heavier, permeated by the strong aroma of unfamiliar incense mixed with something more primal, something that reminded me of copper and salt. Jonathan opened the door unhurriedly, and I couldn't have imagined that what lay behind it would change everything forever. We passed through a dark room until we reached another door made of robust cypress wood, hidden behind a thick velvet curtain. Upon opening it, a bittersweet smell, simultaneously sweet and metallic, mixed with the incense, creating an oppressive atmosphere. A narrow staircase led to the depths of the house, and each step echoed dully, increasing my unease. "I need you to see this. It will transform your understanding of the world," he murmured, as if confiding a secret. The knot in my stomach tightened, but Jonathan's hand holding mine seemed to offer a strange balance between fear and security. We arrived at a spacious hall, illuminated only by the flickering flame of black candles. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries full of symbols I didn't recognize, and the environment seemed to vibrate to the sound of low, almost hypnotic chants. In the center of the hall, a group of people wearing black robes formed a circle around a stone altar. Their faces were hidden by hoods, but their eyes shone with intense fervor in the wavering light. On the altar, a person was immobilized, gagged, with eyes wide open in pure terror. My immediate instinct was to retreat and run, but Jonathan held my hand tighter, his fingers pressing into my skin firmly. "Trust me," he said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of sweetness and urgency. "This is just the beginning of something extraordinary." My thoughts screamed for me to flee, but my body seemed trapped, unable to move. Jonathan released my hand and walked toward the altar, picking up an ancient book with a worn leather cover. He began to chant words in what sounded like Aramaic, and his voice resonated through the air, as if carrying a dense and disturbing energy. The group around him responded in unison, their voices creating an irregular melody that seemed to penetrate to the depths of my soul. Panic began to take over, but something in that environment, perhaps the rhythm of the chants, paralyzed me, as if invisible forces kept me there. Jonathan then raised a ceremonial dagger, whose blade reflected an unsettling light, and approached the person bound to the altar. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out, trapped by the avalanche of fear. Before I could react, I felt firm hands holding my arms. A hooded figure leaned to my side and whispered softly, "Don't move. Now you are a witness. You're part of us, Everything happened in the blink of an eye, a silver gleam followed by a muffled scream that ceased too quickly. The victim seemed to beg for help, but it was useless. No one could help them, and I was paralyzed, unable to react, with the crushing certainty that this was a colossal mistake. And now, lost amid the horror, I didn't know what to do. Blood flowed down the altar, dripping into vessels strategically placed around it. The members of the cult bowed, whispering words that seemed to consume the air, making the environment even more suffocating. Jonathan, with hands tinged red, raised his eyes in my direction. A smile formed on his face, an expression that still gives me chills. "This is what I wanted you to see," he murmured. "True power, the connection with the unknown." I wanted to run, to scream, but my body seemed trapped, sinking into an abyss of despair. The ritual continued, becoming increasingly grotesque. The cult members drank from the vessels, while reciting phrases that sounded as if from another dimension. The environment around me began to distort, as if reality itself were disintegrating. When everything ended, the hall plunged into an unnatural silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Jonathan, his eyes now burning with ardent fanaticism, approached me, his blood-stained hands seeking mine. "Do you understand?" he said, his voice calm but impregnated with a disturbing darkness. "Now you know what it means to be part of something greater." At that moment, I knew I needed to get out of there. Jonathan, that place, everything around me was a threat. But I also understood that escaping wouldn't be so simple. The darkness of that cult was denser and more powerful than I could imagine. With my heart racing, I looked for an exit. The smell of blood, the chants echoing in my mind, and Jonathan's look of satisfaction haunted me as I ran. I reached the vestibule and threw myself against the main door. My hands trembled so much that it took me time to turn the handle. When I finally managed to open it, the cold night air hit my face, bringing momentary relief. I ran out into the street without looking back, driven by primal panic, but soon realized I was lost. I couldn't find my way back to St. Charles Avenue. Going home was unthinkable. Jonathan knew where I lived. I needed to disappear. Every shadow seemed to hide something, and every noise made me jump as if the world itself conspired against me. My fragmented mind told me I was being followed. I looked back several times, but saw no one. Even so, the fear persisted, as if hooded figures were always lurking. I stopped in a dark alley, trying to catch my breath, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I needed to flee, to disappear without a trace. I decided the bus station was my best chance. A bus could take me far away, to my sister's place in a small town that Jonathan didn't know about. When I finally reached the station, the place was almost deserted, with only a few travelers and homeless people occupying the space. I sat trying to calm myself, but suddenly I felt someone beside me. I turned and saw a woman sitting nearby. Her eyes were steady, but there was something strange about her posture. "You will return with us," she said in a tone that was calm but laden with authority. "You cannot escape what you have become now." I gathered what remained of my courage, jumped up, and ran without looking back, hastily leaving the station. I crossed the street blindly, dodging cars passing swiftly. One of them almost hit me. I was thrown to the ground, the impact coursing through my body like a wave of pain. Even dazed, I forced myself to continue. Fear was a cruel but effective fuel. I finally managed to leave the city behind, with an exhausted body and a shattered mind, heading toward the only place that seemed safe, the small town where my sister lived. When I arrived, it was dawn. She welcomed me without hesitation, her eyes heavy with concern. She didn't ask anything, just wrapped me in an embrace that, for a brief moment, gave me the illusion of safety. The first days were a strange mixture of relief and restlessness, but the nights were haunted by nightmares that wouldn't leave me in peace. I relived every detail of the ritual. The chants, the altar, Jonathan's gaze now transformed into something darker, a bottomless well from which I couldn't escape. I would wake in the middle of the night, bathed in sweat, with my heart pounding in my chest. Until one night, the nightmare became real. I woke with a terrifying sensation that someone was watching me. My sister slept in the room next door. I got up carefully, trying not to make noise, and went to the window. As I pulled back the curtain, I was confronted with a vision that paralyzed me. Surrounding the house, under the darkness of night, were figures wearing black robes. Their faces were indistinct, but their eyes, I could feel them. They burned with an almost palpable hatred, fixed on me. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized one of them, Jonathan. From somewhere, perhaps within my own mind, I heard a whisper. He came for you. You belong to us now. More figures emerged, their features charged with something I could only describe as supernatural. Terror took hold of me when I saw Jonathan take a step forward. His face began to transform, the human features contorting, revealing something monstrous, an essence of evil that surpassed any understanding. I couldn't bear it anymore. I was seized by an impulse to survive and ran toward the back door, waking my sister in the process. "We need to get out of here now," I screamed, not bothering to explain. Still confused and frightened, she followed me, and together we fled into the night, leaving behind the house our memories and any vestige of normality. Thus began my new reality, fleeing from town to town, never staying long, always afraid of being found. The cult seemed to be everywhere. The figures from that night didn't disappear. They watched us, followed us, lurked. Finally, we found shelter in a small village, hidden with relatives of my sister in the mountains of Colorado. There I prayed like never before, asking for protection, strength, and a little peace. But above all, I prayed for an end to the torment. Time passed indistinctly, each day blending into the next. We lived adrift, supported by the solidarity of family. Despite this, the threat never completely disappeared. Each day was a battle, each night a new nightmare, but somehow I continued. I clung to a small spark of hope, to a fragile voice within me saying that as long as I fought, there was a chance, however small, of escaping the evil that pursued me. To this day, we continue to flee. I am convinced they are still close, lurking. We no longer have a life of our own. We've abandoned everything, family, friends, and any remnant of hope. I should never have trusted a stranger. I should never have accepted that date. It was that moment that dragged me into complete loss, condemning me to live immersed in incessant fear. If anyone is listening to this, my only advice is to think carefully before trusting someone you don't know. One decision can be enough to make you face true hell. I work as a bartender at a speakeasy-style tavern in downtown Seattle. Let me paint a picture of the place so you can better understand my story. The establishment has a unique energy about it, always bustling, but operating differently than most bars. There are no wait staff. We bartenders handle everything while the chefs work in the back. Anyone wanting food or non-alcoholic drinks orders directly at the counter. And when everything's ready, they pick it up from the same spot. I'm not entirely sure why management chose this system, probably to avoid hiring servers, but the fast pace suits me perfectly. I thrive in this dynamic environment. Surprisingly, the place draws quite a crowd despite not having anything particularly exceptional. The lively atmosphere, good music, relaxed clientele, and a space near the DJ booth for dancing and mingling make all the difference. The constant energy makes the work feel lighter, and the hours fly by. I love meeting new people, so this profession is ideal for me. I think I'd get restless dealing with slower days. Of course, I know some prefer tranquility, but that's not me. That night started like any other. It was mid-autumn, a Tuesday evening that felt like a Friday because of some tech conference in town. We knew the bar would be packed, and I was prepared for the rush. Around 8 o'clock, people began pouring in. The crowd that night seemed different, mostly tech professionals in town for the conference, which usually meant complicated cocktail orders, discussions about startups, and decent tips, which I certainly appreciated. A group from some software company ordered round after round of elaborate cocktails at a pace that almost made me lose my rhythm. They were celebrating a successful presentation, getting louder with each drink. One woman, already quite intoxicated, approached me 3 times with the same awkward attempt at flirtation, while I was trying to keep up with orders. As I turned to handle the mounting tickets, I noticed a couple entering and settling at a table in the corner of the bar. They appeared to be in their 70s, the man wearing an outdated charcoal suit that seemed to belong to the 1950s, the woman in a high-necked dress with a brooch that caught the dim light. There was nothing particularly unusual about them, but I found it curious to see people their age in such a noisy environment. I didn't have time to dwell on it, as the bar was a whirlwind of orders. About 45 minutes later, while finishing a sequence of espresso martinis, I glanced at the couple again. My hands continued working, but my mind focused on them. That's when I noticed something strange. They hadn't ordered anything. No food, no drinks. They weren't conversing either. They just stared fixedly at the wall beside them, motionless as statues. I found that odd, but I couldn't abandon the counter in the middle of the chaos. I figured maybe they were waiting for someone, or didn't understand how our ordering system worked. As soon as I managed to get a moment's break, I went over to see if they needed anything. I approached with the friendliest smile I could muster. They remained motionless, still facing the wall, not even acknowledging my presence. I cleared my throat and politely asked if they wanted something to eat or drink. The woman showed no sign of having heard me, continuing to stare at the emptiness in front of her. The man, however, turned his face slowly, as if in slow motion. When I finally saw his expression, a chill ran down my spine. His skin was extremely pale, marked by deep wrinkles, and his eyes seemed sunken into their sockets. What disturbed me most was that his eyes appeared completely black in the low light, without any visible whites. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a moment and firmly shook his head in silence. There was something in his gaze that left me deeply uncomfortable, almost frozen. I mumbled something and quickly left with a sensation I can't quite describe. Those two people didn't seem to belong in that bar, or even in this time. I avoided looking at their table for a good while. Later, when the crowd thinned out, I remembered them and decided to take another look. The shock nearly made me drop the glass I was holding. They were both looking directly at me. I met the woman's gaze, but she didn't look away for even a moment. It was one of the most uncomfortable experiences I've ever had while working. Her eyes held the same unsettling darkness as her companions. I turned away and pretended to be busy, trying to ignore the growing sense of panic. The strangest part was that despite the packed bar, nobody else seemed to notice them. People would walk right past their table without a glance, as if the couple was invisible to everyone but me. At one point, a drunk patron even bumped into their table, but instead of apologizing or acknowledging them, he simply readjusted his path as if navigating around an inanimate object. A short time later, I looked again at their table, but they had vanished. Enormous relief washed over me, though I feel a bit cruel saying that. The rest of the night, I caught myself constantly scanning the room, afraid they might reappear. Later, while closing the bar with Morgan, my colleague, the scene still haunted my thoughts. Morgan has worked there for years and has a special talent for remembering anyone who passes through the bar. I decided to ask if she had noticed anything strange that night. She looked at me in confusion and said she had no idea what I was talking about. I insisted, describing the elderly couple who had sat in the corner. Morgan, however, shook her head, claiming she didn't recall anyone matching that description. She even joked that I must be imagining things. Then she proceeded to list dozens of people who had been there and their orders, but at no point did she mention the couple. Despite laughing along with her to not seem crazy, inside I was terrified. I knew what I had seen. How could she not have noticed them? As we left and locked up the bar, I began to question whether it had all been a product of my imagination. But on the way to my car, something happened that made my heart nearly stop. Under the dim light of a street lamp across the road, two dark silhouettes stood motionless. There was no doubt it was them, but something was different now. They were closer than before, and though I couldn't make out their features clearly in the darkness, I could feel their eyes fixed on me. I tried to scream, but my voice simply wouldn't come out. My body acted on instinct. I ran to the car, hastily got in, locked the doors, and drove off without looking back. The drive home was terrifying. I kept muttering, "Oh my God," repeatedly, trying to stay calm while driving. My mind was racing with questions. Why couldn't Morgan see them? Were they real? Am I losing my sanity? Nothing made sense. For 3 nights after that, I called in sick. I couldn't bring myself to return to the bar. When I finally did go back, everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing when I turned to look. 2 weeks later, I was working a relatively quiet Monday shift when an elderly regular customer I'd known for years came in for his usual whiskey neat. As we chatted, I casually mentioned the strange couple, describing them as vividly as I could. The color drained from his face. He told me that decades ago, before the building was a bar, it had been a small hotel. In 1953, an elderly couple had been found dead in the corner room, the exact spot where our table now stood. According to local legend, they had checked in but never checked out, dying together in their sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning due to a faulty heater. I wish I could say this story had a conclusion, but it doesn't. I still work at that bar, and occasionally, when the night gets quiet and the lights are low, I catch sight of them sitting at that corner table, staring at the wall. They never order, never speak, and no one else ever seems to notice them. I've learned to live with our silent observers, but I still avoid their table whenever possible, and I never, ever serve that corner alone. I want to share a disturbing incident that happened to my father when he worked as a sheriff's deputy in our small town in rural Maine. This happened many years ago, but the story still gives me chills and raises questions about what we consider reality. My father, Robert, was on patrol with his partner Keith one winter night when they received an urgent call over the radio to investigate a house at the edge of town. Nearby residents reported hearing terrifying screams coming from inside and feared something horrible was happening. Despite their concern, no one had the courage to enter themselves, so they urgently requested police assistance. My father was driving that night and accelerated through the snow-covered roads to respond to the call. When they turned onto Willow Lane, they saw anxious neighbors waving frantically toward their patrol car. Most were bundled in heavy robes and winter boots, which wasn't surprising given the biting cold of that February midnight. Without wasting any time, he and Keith stepped out of the vehicle. Before any of the neighbors could provide more details, a sharp, piercing scream echoed from the abandoned Victorian house, cutting through the silence. It was a woman's voice, filled with pure terror and desperation. My father instructed everyone to return to their homes, warning that it could be dangerous to remain nearby. Nevertheless, many hid behind curtains, peering through windows as the drama unfolded. He and Keith then approached the house, which was visibly deteriorating with its peeling paint and sagging porch. They knocked loudly on the front door, announcing in authoritative voices that the sheriff's department was present and that whoever was inside should surrender peacefully. No response came, only another scream, even more disturbing than the first. According to my father, the sound was so anguished that it made his blood freeze in his veins. Keith took the initiative and kicked the door. The old, rotted wood gave way easily. With firearms and flashlights in hand, they entered and inspected every corner of the ground floor. What they found was complete abandonment, garbage strewn about, an unbearable musty odor, cobwebs stretching across doorways, and broken furniture. There was no sign of anyone, neither people nor animals. It was then that they heard noises coming from upstairs, something dragging across the floor, as if someone or something was moving slowly. Even without hearing more screams, they decided to climb the stairs cautiously, following standard procedures. On the second floor, they began illuminating the rooms one by one. But to their surprise, there was absolutely nothing there. No person, no hiding place, not even an open window. It was as if no one could have escaped without being seen. The strangest part awaited them in one of the bedrooms. In the center of the floor, a large circle with a pentagram was drawn in what appeared to be dried blood. The walls were covered with inscriptions in a language my father couldn't recognize, all painted with what looked like black candle wax and rust-colored substances. They immediately secured the location, as it was clear this was a dangerous place filled with disturbing mysteries. Afterward, my father and Keith spoke with several residents to better understand what had been happening. They reported that since around 11 that night, they began hearing frightening screams. At first, no one could identify where they were coming from, but upon opening their windows or stepping outside to check, they realized the sound was coming from that abandoned Victorian house. The situation left everyone frightened and perplexed, since the property had been empty for decades. Some mentioned that on certain nights, particularly when the moon was full, it was possible to see hooded figures entering through one of the front windows, always in the dead of night. They suspected these individuals were conducting strange rituals there, but never had the courage to approach out of fear of what might happen. They preferred to lock themselves inside their homes and not risk investigating further. These accounts helped paint a picture of the situation, but no one could explain whose screams they were or what exactly was happening inside. What made the case even more bizarre was that my father and Keith returned the next morning with reinforcements and crime scene investigators, only to find that the pentagram, the wall inscriptions, and all traces of the ritual had completely vanished. The room was bare, with only dust-covered floorboards. My father developed a theory. He believes it was all the work of something supernatural. The basis for his hypothesis are the clear signs of occult activity on the upper floor. The stories from neighbors about suspicious figures entering the location shortly before the incident, and most convincingly, the inexplicable disappearance of all evidence overnight. For him, the connection was evident, but naturally, such an idea could never be included in an official report. In the end, the case remained unsolved. Sometime later, authorities decided to demolish the house, since there was no legal owner for the property. What happened to that land afterward, whether it remained vacant or something new was built there, we don't know, as we no longer live in that town. But my father still wakes up sometimes in the middle of the night, claiming he can hear that same blood-curdling scream echoing in his nightmares. And the strangest part, Keith, his partner that night, has no recollection of ever responding to such a call. According to him, they had a quiet, uneventful shift that winter evening. It's not easy to talk about choices that changed my life forever, but telling this story is the only way I've found to cope with everything that happened. I hope it reaches others and makes them reflect. My name is Morgan, and ever since I was little, I always imagined what my wedding day would be like. While other children played doctor or house, I would wrap myself in my mother's old lace curtains, improvising a dress and walking down our hallway as if it were the aisle of a grand cathedral. My mother and my younger sister, Lily, would always applaud when I performed this spectacle. Mom used to say I was born to dream big and love deeply. I never thought this was a flaw despite Lily's, teasing about my fairy tale ideas and belief in happily ever afters. From an early age, I had decided that my heart and body would be given on my wedding day to the person with whom I'd share my life forever. While girls at school started experiencing their first crushes and flirtations, I remained faithful to my promise. I faced curious glances, malicious comments, and my sister Lily's skepticism. Despite being only 2 years younger than me, Lily seemed to belong to a completely different universe. She was rebellious, constantly challenging rules, and had her first boyfriend by 16. She never missed a chance to criticize my choices. "You're missing out on the best parts of life, sis," she would say with that provocative smile that made me feel old-fashioned. Despite our differences, we were very close. Lily always told me about her adventures and romances, while I, with my dreamy side, talked about my ideal of finding a perfect, lasting love. It wasn't until I was 27 that I met Ethan. Time seemed to have passed quickly. Despite having experienced some relationships and 2 serious boyfriends in college, I never went beyond certain boundaries, which usually drove suitors away. But Ethan was different. We met at my friend Rachel's 30th birthday party in the autumn of 2017. He was her cousin who had just moved to Chicago after spending several years in Seattle. I was impressed by his appearance. Those green eyes seemed to hide stories and secrets. But what really won me over was his demeanor. Polite, attentive, and respectful, he made me feel like I had finally found someone aligned with my values. During our first private conversation at a small coffee shop downtown, with jazz playing softly in the background, I decided to be upfront. I told him about my decision to remain celibate until marriage. I expected him to disappear like others before him, but his reaction was unexpected. "That's admirable," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's rare to find someone so firm in their convictions these days." That was the beginning of a romance that seemed straight out of a novel. During the following year, Ethan was everything I had ever dreamed of. He supported me, respected me, and never rushed things. Our love grew day by day, nourished by the promise of a future together. 1 year later, during a romantic dinner in a rooftop restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan, with the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars, he proposed. He pulled out a ring, so beautiful it seemed to have come from a fairy tale. My first instinct was to call Lily and share the news. "That's amazing. I'm finally getting a brother-in-law," she exclaimed on the other end of the line, full of excitement. I felt her happiness for me was genuine. In the months that followed, I was swept up in the whirlwind of preparations. Every detail had to be perfect. White roses for the flowers, decorations in ivory and gold, and a menu that featured our favorite dishes. But the dress was a story in itself. After visiting countless boutiques, I found the perfect piece. A vintage-inspired gown with intricate lace that seemed to have been designed specifically for me. The moment I tried it on, I knew it was the one. My mother, who was beside me in the fitting room, couldn't hold back her tears. "My love, you look stunning, exactly as you've always dreamed," she whispered. However, as the days passed, I began to notice something strange about Lily. Although she was naturally a bit flighty, she suddenly seemed even more distant. She missed family gatherings, always with an excuse related to her marketing job. And on the rare occasions when she did appear, She seemed disconnected, as if her mind was wandering elsewhere. It didn't make sense to me. One day, I decided to ask her directly what was going on, but she just laughed and joked. I guess I'm suffering from sister stress, because I never imagined anyone would actually put a ring on your finger. Ethan also started acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the wedding. At times, he seemed distant, lost in thought, almost as if he was carrying a burden. When I questioned him, his answer was always the same: work stress and anxiety about the big day. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Morgan," he would say as he held me tight in his arms. Despite his words, a small sense of unease began to grow inside me, an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't shake. Finally, the big day arrived. Everything was as I had dreamed. Clear skies with just enough clouds to make the sunset perfect, a gentle breeze. I woke up early, divided between enthusiasm and nervousness, and got ready alongside my friends and my mother, who seemed obsessed with adjusting every detail of my veil to make it perfect. I didn't see Lily around, and when I asked my mother, she suggested that my sister might still be getting ready at home. 2 hours before the ceremony, almost ready, I faced my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman I saw there. I felt beautiful, radiating a happiness I never thought possible. At that moment, Rachel, my friend and maid of honor, entered the room holding a cream-colored envelope. Her expression gave me chills. "Morgan, this is for you," she said, her voice breaking. I took the envelope, feeling ice coursing through my body. I immediately recognized Ethan's handwriting, and my hands trembled as I opened it. Something inside me screamed that these words would change everything, but I was reluctant to believe it. "My dear Morgan," I began to read with my heart racing and my stomach turning. I spent the night trying to find the right words for this. There's no easy way to explain. I cannot marry you. Not because I don't love you. You will always be someone special to me. But something happened that I cannot ignore. Something I tried to hide, and that's eating me up with guilt. I've fallen in love with Lily. The paper slipped from my hands. The words, like poison, fixed themselves in my mind. "This can't be happening," I whispered softly as I ran my eyes over the words again, wishing somehow the text would transform. My sister Lily, the woman I had grown up with, shared secrets with, trusted with my deepest feelings. "It wasn't planned," the letter continued. "It all started with casual conversations, then meetings that seemed harmless. We fought against it, but the more we tried to stay away, the more we were pushed by something greater. We can't continue like this. We can't bear to see your suffering and carry this guilt. We're leaving together." After reading this, the silence in the room seemed like a black hole that sucked everything in. I could barely stand when I tried to speak. What came out was a primal scream, so fierce and desolate that it came from a place inside me I didn't know existed. My mother tried to wrap me in her arms, but I was completely beside myself. I screamed, pulled at the dress I had chosen with such care, and tore it as if that would ease the pain. "How could they do this to me?" I cried out. I don't know how much time passed. I only remember Rachel reading the letter in a low voice with wide eyes, while my mother and friends cried beside me. They tried to comfort me, but soon began organizing things, giving explanations to the guests. They said Ethan had been in an accident, but in a community like ours, where everyone knew each other's business, it wouldn't take long for the truth to come out. The following hours were an endless nightmare. The reception hall, the church ceremony, the dinner, everything was canceled. Rachel and the other bridesmaids took on the difficult task of explaining the situation to the guests, trying to contain the embarrassment. But I knew that within hours, the rumors would have spread like wildfire. Locked in my room, still wearing pieces of my wedding dress, I watched my life fall apart. My mother tried to console me, but I couldn't even look at her. I spent that entire night immersed in memories, reliving every moment with Lily, looking for signs that might have alerted me to this betrayal. I thought about the times she seemed distant, about Ethan's work meetings, and the moments when I caught them whispering, stopping as soon as I arrived. How did I not notice? How could I have been so naive? 7 days have passed since that day that should have been the happiest of my life, but became my worst nightmare. Our tight-knit community in Lake Forest was a cruel stage for scandals like this. On the streets, people would avert their eyes or stop their conversations as soon as they saw me. It was as if I had become a specter, a living reminder of betrayal and shame. My mother was devastated, not only by the failed wedding, but also by Lily's betrayal. I caught her several times crying softly, holding old photos of the two of us, wondering when everything had fallen apart. Then one afternoon, Rachel, who remained steadfastly by my side, entered my room with 2 plane tickets in hand. "Enough is enough, Morgan." She threw the tickets on the bed unceremoniously. "You need to get out of here. Leave all this behind. We're going to Santa Fe." "Rachel, I don't think that will solve anything," I tried to argue, but she didn't give me space. "I've already talked to your boss. You have accumulated vacation time. The flight is tomorrow. Pack your bag because this isn't a request." There was something in Rachel's firm and decided tone that made me yield. Maybe she was right. I needed to leave at least for a few days. That suffocating place and the pity-laden expressions that surrounded me, constantly reminding me of what I had lost. We arrived in Santa Fe under a clear sky illuminated by a vigorous sun, accompanied by a dry breeze that seemed to carry the promise of rest. Rachel had booked a hotel near the historic plaza, with a view so impressive it seemed to have come from a postcard. In the first few days, we followed the classic tourist itinerary. Walks through art galleries, visits to small craft shops, tour of ancient ruins. Rachel seemed determined not to leave me space to think, filling my time with activities that, at least temporarily, kept the shadow of pain at bay. At night, we frequented the busiest bars in the tourist area. Rachel insisted that I dress up, apply makeup, and perhaps rediscover some spark of who I was before everything collapsed. "This will do you good, Morgan," she would say as she helped me choose outfits. It was during one of these nights, in a crowded bar animated by a live band playing soulful southwestern jazz, that I met Julian. Rachel had gone to the bathroom, and I was alone at the table when I noticed a man watching me from across the room. He didn't seem to be part of that scene, wearing a black shirt and with slightly disheveled hair. His serious expression contrasted with the festive atmosphere around him. But it was his gaze that held me, an almost magnetic intensity that prevented me from looking away. When our eyes met, he smiled, and I felt my heart race for a moment, Before I could react, he was already on his way to my table. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the empty chair across from me. His voice was deep, marked by a slight accent I couldn't identify. Normally, I would have refused, but there was something in the way he looked at me, and perhaps in the fragility of my emotional state, that led me to accept. "Sure," I responded, feeling a slight tension. He introduced himself as Julian, extending his hand. I shook his firm fingers, murmuring, "Morgan." We talked for a few minutes. At first, I was reserved, but Julian seemed to notice more than what I was saying. Suddenly, he commented with a serenity that disconcerted me. "It seems like you're not really enjoying the night." I was surprised by his direct perception. My reaction was to laugh awkwardly, averting my eyes. "Is it that obvious?" "It's not just what I see," he responded, leaning slightly in my direction. "It's what I feel. Your eyes say a lot, and they seem to guard an immense sadness." There was something in the way he spoke, a gentleness that made it seem like he had known me for a long time. Perhaps it was the alcohol, or the relief of being understood without judgment, but I suddenly found myself opening up. I told him everything: the ruined wedding, the betrayal by Ethan and Lily, the public humiliation, and the unbearable pain. He listened to every word attentively, without interrupting me, as if he were hearing something precious. When I finished, Julian remained silent for a few moments, as if reflecting on what he had heard. Then he leaned in even more, and his voice came out so low it almost seemed like a secret. "What if I told you I could make them pay for what they did to you?" At first, I laughed, thinking it was just a joke or a way to comfort me, but his face didn't show the slightest trace of humor. "And how would you do that?" I tried to sound ironic when asking, but his answer came in an even more grave and serious tone. "Some call me a warlock, others a shaman. The name matters little. What matters is that I can make those who hurt you face the consequences of what they've done." Any sensible person would have left the bar at that instant and gone away without looking back. An older man in a bar claiming to be a warlock was the perfect scenario for trouble. But something about him, the way he spoke, the intensity of that penetrating gaze, made me hesitate. "A warlock," I repeated, trying to sound skeptical, although my voice wavered. "Don't you believe in magic, Morgan?" He asked in such a low and disturbing tone that it gave me chills. "After everything that happened to you, after the betrayal you suffered, don't you think there's something beyond what the eyes can see?" "This is insane," I murmured, but I remained seated. There was something in the conversation, a mixture of mystery and threat, that frightened me but also attracted me. The desire to see them pay for what they had done was overwhelming, too great to be ignored. "I just need a photo of them," he said, almost in a whisper. "One image is enough to initiate the curse. And of course I need something from you too." "Something from me?" I asked, my voice almost gone, fearing someone might hear. "Yes, something they took from you. Something that belongs to you but has special meaning." As he spoke, his eyes seemed to burn. It was hard to look away. He explained, with a frightening coldness, that I would need to give myself to the idea for the spell to be completed. That there was a price for this kind of vengeance. My instinct screamed that I should leave, forget all that. But the anger inside me, fueled by pain, kept me there. Would I have the courage to seal a pact with him? Would I allow darkness to resolve what I could not? When Rachel returned from the bathroom, I introduced Julian as someone I had just met. We ordered more drinks, and I forced myself to laugh, to dance, to pretend that his words weren't engraved in my mind. But I knew that inside, I was devastated, thoughts about his proposal consuming me. When we said goodbye, Julian handed me a small card with a phone number and an address written by hand. If you ever want justice, you know where to find me. His smile, which before had seemed intriguing, now seemed to haunt me. I put the card in my purse, promising myself I would never use it. But there was a part of me, the broken part, full of resentment that knew I might. 2 days later, we returned home. During the flight, I tried to convince myself that everything that happened in Santa Fe was just a delusion, a desperate attempt to escape reality. But that card, hidden at the bottom of my purse, seemed to gain weight every time I thought about it. I couldn't throw it away. Sometimes my fingers would find it, and something inside me refused to get rid of that piece of paper. Days passed, but the pain didn't diminish. I found myself reviewing old photos on my phone, Ethan and Lily laughing together, seemingly perfect moments at family gatherings. Each image was a cruel reminder of the betrayal that tore me apart from within. It was on an ordinary evening, as if taken by a greater force, that I picked up the phone, looked at the number on the card, and dialed. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for it. His deep, serene voice ran through my body like a chill. "I knew you would call, Morgan." He spoke as if it were an inescapable sentence. He told me to meet him that same night at his house, on the outskirts of our town. My reason screamed that it was insane, but my feet seemed unwilling to obey me. It was already night when I arrived at the address Julian had given me. The house was small, surrounded by tall, twisted trees, as if their shadows hid ancestral secrets. I knocked on the door, and he opened it immediately. Without a single word, he gestured for me to enter. The air inside was heavy, impregnated with the smell of herbs mixed with something I couldn't identify. "Did you bring the photo?" he asked, going straight to the point. I took out my phone and showed him an image of Ethan and Lily. He analyzed the screen in silence, murmuring words in an unknown language before returning the device to me. "This is just the beginning," he whispered, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He continued, "To complete the pact, I need more. I need that which they stole from you by crushing your dreams, your delivery, your essence." I could barely breathe. Everything in me said I should run away. But a wounded part consumed by hatred, kept me there, motionless. "What does that mean?" I asked, even fearing the answer. "If you give yourself to me tonight, the spell will be sealed. The suffering they caused you will transform into torment for them." Julian approached me. I saw something in his gaze, a dark, almost supernatural glow that paralyzed me. His presence was like a dense shadow that seemed to consume the air around me. Despite the fear, the thirst for revenge took hold of me. Without saying anything more, I agreed. That night, I gave myself to Julian. There was something strange about everything, about his touch, about his caresses. His hands seemed to burn like fire, carrying an energy that was both fascinating and terrifying. It was as if something malevolent emanated from him, something I couldn't comprehend. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and my head was throbbing. Julian was already dressed, sitting in a chair beside the bed, observing me with a calm, unshakable gaze. "The pact is done," he murmured with a tranquility that deeply disturbed me. "But remember, Morgan, you can never be with another man. This mark you now carry is eternal." As I dressed hastily, I felt fear spreading throughout my body. I didn't know if I had lost my mind, or if I had sacrificed something much greater than I understood. But I knew there was no going back. Before I left, he gave me a small pendant made of a dark stone. "To protect you from them and from yourself." I didn't respond. I just put the amulet in my purse and left that house with a heavy heart and a new terror pulsing inside me. 3 weeks later, Ethan and Lily returned to town. I found out about this through an unexpected call from my mother. "Morgan, my daughter, Ethan and Lily are back, but something isn't right. You'd better come here." The path to my parents' house never seemed so long. When I arrived, I saw my mother at the door, holding a handkerchief with trembling hands, her face pale and her eyes heavy with concern. I entered the living room and saw them. A chill ran down my spine. Ethan and Lily were there, but they were no longer the people I knew. They were thin, with sunken faces, yellowed skin, and deep dark circles under their eyes. They looked like haunted versions of themselves. "Morgan," Ethan's voice barely came out, weak and hoarse. "We need help," Lily whispered, her voice trembling, laden with fear and a vulnerability I had never seen in her. I looked at her coldly, trying to maintain my composure, but something in me faltered. I felt a hint of compassion. She began to speak, explaining that it all started weeks ago. She said they didn't understand what was happening, that they had sought medical help, but no examination showed anything abnormal. As Lily spoke, Ethan beside her coughed feebly. I observed the two of them, struggling to hide the whirlwind of feelings consuming me, a mixture of horror and bitter satisfaction. Julian's spell was working. The promise of revenge was being fulfilled before my eyes. But seeing them in that state, so fragile, so human, an uneasiness began to settle in me. Was this what I really wanted? In the days that followed, both were hospitalized, but no treatment seemed to have any effect. Their condition worsened each day. The doctors were perplexed. The tests showed nothing unusual, but it was as if their strength was being slowly drained. My mother, not understanding the gravity of the situation, divided her days between home and the hospital, praying fervently for a miracle. One afternoon, I was alone with Lily in the hospital room. She held my hand with her cold fingers and looked at me with tearful eyes. "Morgan, forgive us for what we did." Her voice was a thread, almost inaudible, laden with guilt. "I don't know how we got to this. It wasn't just attraction. It was something that seemed greater than us." I closed my eyes, trying to block out her words, trying to push away the memories that insisted on returning. But Lily didn't stop. "I feel like we're being punished, Morgan," she said with tears streaming down her face. "It all started after that night in the small town where we tried to start over." Her words hit me like a blow. I knew exactly what she meant, but I couldn't bear to hear it. Julian's spell wasn't just a vague promise. It was a cruel reality that now placed me face to face with the weight of my choices. Days later, Ethan didn't make it. His body simply gave in, without any plausible medical explanation. On the day of the funeral, I observed from a distance, hidden behind a tree. I didn't have the courage to face my family or the small group of people present. Guilt consumed me like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. Lily, meanwhile, remained hospitalized, fighting against the shadow of something no one could explain. My mother spent hours by her side, praying and wondering what had destroyed our family. I, on the other hand, began to question whether the price of my revenge wasn't too high. Guilt became a constant companion, tormenting me at every moment. I tried to move on with life. I convinced myself that all of that could be just a series of unfortunate coincidences, that there was no spell at all, and for a time, I almost believed it. That was when I met Aaron, a new colleague at work. He was kind, educated, and his smile seemed to illuminate something in me that I thought was lost. We started going out. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps I could start over, find a new chance at happiness. But on the first night we tried to be together, an unbearable pain took hold of me. It was as if thousands of needles were piercing my brain. I went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and saw blood running from my nose. At that moment, I understood. It was the curse. Julian had kept his promise. That night, I cried until there were no tears left. I was trapped by something I had chosen myself. The next day, I dialed Julian's number. He answered on the first ring, as if he knew I would call. "I warned you, Morgan," he said with a cold, tranquil voice. "The price of revenge is high. Now you are marked." I begged, pleaded with tears for him to undo the spell, that I could no longer bear to live like this. But Julian responded with an icy tranquility. "What is done is done. Wasn't this what you wanted? Now you belong to me." Months turned into years. Lily remained in a coma, an empty body trapped between life and death, while I lived chained to an invisible prison. I avoided any kind of relationship, distanced myself from any closeness. It wasn't just fear, but the certainty that something in me had changed forever. Sometimes Julian would call me. His low, calm voice was like a constant reminder that I had no escape. And on the nights when I held the dark pendant he gave me, I would wonder, was it he who brought this curse into my life, or was it I myself? Today, as I walked through the cemetery, my eyes fell upon a white rose. It was identical to what I would have carried on my wedding day. I stood looking at the flower for a long time, and the dreams I once had began to surface, the desires that were torn from me by betrayal. It was then that I realized, with painful clarity, that there is no one left to blame. The betrayal hurt me, but the choice for revenge was mine. The price I paid wasn't imposed by Julian, but by myself. I now live as a prisoner, not of a spell, but of the consequences of the hatred I nurtured. My revenge, which seemed like justice, has transformed into my eternal condemnation. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.